Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. It's great you are here. Great to be here in the rooms of the Institute for Advanced Studies at the University of Loughborough. And this is the first thanks I have to say. Thanks to the Institute for hosting us, because we are the project group working on the AHRC-DFG funded project, completing socialisms and African agency, the Sino-Soviet rivalry in Tanzania during the Cold War, from the 1950s to 1990s. So that's both the title of the workshop, but it's also the title of the project that we are engaged in. And it's really great to have this opportunity to come together and also to share, hopefully, our ideas with you who have joined us online. We've already been discussing things for the past 1.5 days, and we are presenting some of the preliminary findings to you, and I really take the designation workshop quite seriously. So this is a lot of this is work in progress that is by no means finished, is still ongoing. So we really also love to hear your input about this. I don't want to say a lot of about the content. Those of you who are joining us have, I assume, read the workshop abstract. What I do want to emphasize is that we are today a mixture of people. So some are really project members, have a role in the project. Some are guests that have kindly agreed to be here and contribute to our work. And so we are a bit of a mixture of that. It's also probably useful to know that how we organize the conference. So we have a number of people sitting in this room. We have a number of people who are project team members, or local colleagues who are joining online and will be able to make verbal contributions, and then the vast majority of you will be able to communicate with us through the chat. The chat is monitored, so Kieran, to whom I owe special thanks, who's the organizational backbone of all of this and of the IAS, will monitor the chat and will feed your questions and comments into the chat on a regular basis. You will have noticed that we have 3 panels of somewhat uneven length. So a first one that contains 1 paper, then we have another panel that contains 2 papers, and then finally a round table. The presentations will take about 25 minutes, followed by an up to 10-minute commentary. And then there is a little bit of time for discussion. If there are any questions that are unresolved during the panels, then at the end, I hope that we have enough time to have a concluding discussion on everything that you want to share with us. I think one final point in terms of where we stand. So the project started on the UK side. This is a UK-German collaboration, UK-German-Tanzanian collaboration. So between myself and Kirsten Bönker from the Northeast Institute at the University of Hamburg and Andrea Kifyasi at the University of Dar es Salaam. So it's a cooperation between the 3 universities. You will see each of them later on. I will probably, after this, pretty much have 1 panel chair, but after that I will take a back seat. So on the UK side, this project started in mid-February, and on the German side in early April. So we've been together, working together for slightly over half a year. And this underscores what I said initially, that this is very much work in progress. And the other thing that I think is important for you to know is that this is a project that's really very much built on the division of labor. So it brings together specialists on Russia, specialists on China, and specialists on Tanzania. And one of the great challenges of the project is to connect all these different stories of Sino-Soviet, Sino-Tanzanian, and Soviet-Tanzanian relations. And hopefully the workshop and your contributions to the discussion will help us navigate these and help us to connect the dots and synthesize these different stories. I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to say by way of an introduction. This is much shorter than I had allowed time in the program, but I think for the sake of having more opportunity to discuss, I would say we start the first panel now, and Andrea, you would be chairing that, if that's okay. So I will hand over this to you, and Zhijian, when you are ready, and you have to, this is the owl, you have to really focus the owl, and then you'll be speaking into the camera, and people will see your face from the front. Okay, so over to you.
Okay, thank you, Thoralf, for your introductory remark. My name is Andrea Azizi Kifyasi. I'm a historian at the University of Dar es Salaam. I specialize on China-Tanzania relations. I'm honored to chair this panel where we have one presenter, Zhijian from Yancheng Institute of Technology, and he's going to present his paper titled Thermo-Socialism, Socialist Tropical Architecture, and the Sino-Soviet Competition for Decolonizing Tanzania. So, Zhijian, please, the floor is yours, and I hope you introduce yourself more about you before you start your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you for Andrea's kind introduction. And yeah, I have just finished my doctoral degree from National University of Singapore, and have just come back to China to teach in, but I'm currently teaching in the School of Foreign Languages in the Global History cluster. And today, I'm happy to share a really hot topic, literally hot, because I say the tropical architecture called the thermal socialism in the Sino-Soviet competition for Tanzania. My research is at the intersection of environment history, architecture history, international relations, and STS, science and technology studies. In the Cold War and decolonization, tropical Africa is a contested battlefield with a fierce competition between various old and new donors in the name of development aid. As we all know, the decolonization did not mean the end of the metropolitan impact. Some literature has already talked about how the tropical architecture was institutionalized in London as the systematic knowledge in ensuring the enduring British dominance even after the decolonization in the tropics. However, these post-colonial states were never passive recipients of these internal influences at all. For example, Tanzania's National Development Corporation, NDC, was really powerful in approving projects and allocating resources in this foreign aid system. To offset the lingering metropolitan influence, many African leaders turned to the socialist bloc, adopted the socialist planned economy, and received socialist assistance as an alternative path to modernization. In the past decade, moving beyond the colonial, in the past decade, moving beyond the colonial network or Cold War superpowers, some scholars started to look into the tropicality of some emerging donors that are marginalized before, such as Finland, Greece, and especially socialist China. Socialist China is so unique in the socialist camp. Following the Sino-Soviet split in 1960, the Chinese promoted an alternative socialist development model to their Soviet rivals in Africa, which was described by Jeremiah Friedman as the shadow Cold War in the anti-imperialism versus anti-capitalism. As latecomers, when the Chinese arrived in Africa, they found themselves in direct competition with other actors already on this testing ground. such as from whether capitalist, socialist, or non-aligned countries. Today, we take for granted Chinese infrastructure investment in Africa, but this was never a smooth process. In its initial stage, after the Bandung Conference in 1955. In the 1950s, Chinese engineers from Beijing were challenged by their unfamiliar tropical climate, such as a direct transfer of northern Chinese building types without considering the heat and humidity. In the 1960s, Chen Dengao from Beijing Design Institute started to juxtapose southern China and the global south based on their shared hot climates. Although Chen's climatic knowledge was inspired by the British and Soviet engineers, the Chinese tropicality, according to the Maoist definition of the Third World, was quite different from the British Empire and the Soviet Union. According to him, tropical problems in Africa could be navigated by the Chinese from within and vice versa, based on their domestic expertise in Maoist Canton by the South China Institute of Technology, SCIT, or Huanan Gongxueyuan. In this paper, based on the archival materials from China, Tanzania, and Britain, especially the internal documents I call the 内部资料, I will look into two sample socialist cases in Tanzania. The Friendship Textile Mill in Dar es Salaam and the East German-built Kilimani housing in Zanzibar in relation to African post-independence politics and their domestic conditions. I will answer two main questions. Firstly, how did the Chinese tropicality evolve in the Cold War and global socialism? Second one, how did it work as an alternative to that of socialist North following the Sino-Soviet split? In the 1960s, the Soviet engineers mostly attended to African housing crises, especially the colonial segregations of thermal comfort between the white community and the native slums, as shown in the Soviet architecture journals. I call this thermal segregation in residences, while the Chinese experts focused on thermal segregations in industries between the cooling enclaves of European office buildings and terrible working environment for Tanzanian working class, as they described. So we can understand why the Soviets and Eastern Europeans always paid particular attention to mass housing in their publications to showcase the superiority of socialism over capitalism in Africa, while for China, most of its projects were industrial infrastructures. Over 77% of these projects, according to the data, with almost no housing or hotels in this. China's anti-imperialist focus on the self-reliant industries even proved more popular among African leaders than Khrushchev's peaceful coexistence policy, because they also believed that only industrial foundation could result in real independence, according to Naria. However, how were their divergent revolutionary agendas reflected in the architecture construction? As some literature argues, we can find quite similar design forms, climatic design in their forms, or so-called British tropical architecture styles. But my question still is, what is the difference between Chinese and Soviet tropical architecture in Africa, despite very similar architecture forms from the appearance? So, since climate was so important, drawing on the theories of technopolitics and Nikos Staroselsky's critical temperature studies, I will develop this notion, thermal regimes, I call 热制度, to capture the interdependence between architecture's climatic control and political power, the exercise of political power. I will argue that temperature is neither neutral nor objective because it masks the violence, the thermal violence. For example, the uneven distribution of cooling between the Indian coolies and the British colonizers in the colonial India. This notion helps me understand how tropical expertise was mobilized by state institutions to redistribute heat and cold for certain political goals. I argue that in socialist Tanzania and socialist China, thermal regimes satisfied the developmental ambitions, while their endless desire for industrialization in turn reinforced this techno-political system of thermal regimes. In the 1950s, in fact, China's post-war reconstruction was deeply influenced by the Soviet design norms, such as the adaptation of the micro-district planning and the mass housing typology to the northern China. However, these Soviet norms caused many problems in subtropical Canton when it was transformed from a consumption city to a socialist production city. For instance, this enclosed composition of the neighborhood units and the central corridor housing types were extremely unfavorable for the ventilation in the Canton's hot climates. China Academy of Building Research, or CABR, was the largest research institute under the Ministry of Works to solve these problems through modern science and technology. In 1955, it proposed different climatic zoning plans for the standardized construction, such as the three-zone plan based on the American notion of effective temperature, 有效温度. It was developed by the American Society of Heating and Ventilating Engineers in the 1920s in their laboratory research, which was a subjective evaluation of people's sensation of heat and cold based on only 3 parameters: air temperatures, relative humidity, and airflow. This reductive understanding of climate reached a quite narrow comfort zone, like the gray area, like from 18 to 23 degrees. When most areas of the world were deemed uncomfortable, they all become potential markets for the carrier companies' air conditioning technology, which was called thermal capitalism. Some scholars also show that how this comfort chart was adopted in British African colonies to legitimize the expertise of British products, which was called thermal colonialism. Then, what is thermal socialism? Based on the effective temperature of Chinese cities in July, above 28 degrees, the CABR defined the Canton and Wuhan as a third zone of the subtropical climate in which architects must ensure the cross ventilation in summer. When visiting the Moscow, Chinese experts were surprised at Khrushchev era's achievements in climatic zoning and the prefabricated systems for each zone in the Soviet Union. In 1957, climatic zoning was elevated as a key project in China under the supervision of Soviet engineer Maximov. Maximov also shared this belief in the heat balance model, determined by 3 parameters. At the conference on climatic zoning, his point was endorsed by Chinese expert Yang Mingding from Shanghai Medical College, who emphasized that the heat balance of human body can never be destroyed. Otherwise, it will cause discomfort and decrease socialist workers' labor efficiency. Therefore, architecture design in hot climates was really important for the Great Leap Forward production. At the Guangzhou textile factory, we can find how the formerly scattered layout was replaced by a more centralized air-conditioned workshop, which was believed as creating a more efficient thermal environment. Based on this comfort zone from 19 to 24 degrees as the most favorable for workers and products, its passive cooling components were overshadowed by the air conditioning rooms in the middle, which created a more constant and unchanging microclimate. However, for textile workers here, this comfort was only for the cotton products instead of themselves, because they suffered a lot from the strictly controlled artificial climate in the workshop. Under the principle of production first, livelihood second, the thermal environment for housing was much more terrible, as I mentioned before, than the workshop because of the much lower design standards. At the workers' hostel, the tropical building problems I mentioned before also existed. When each room was subdivided by more partitions, the ill ventilated conditions were worsened a lot. Since the air-conditioned workshop continuously heated up the outdoor environment, making the passive cooling strategies no longer enough for comfort, people had no choice but to rely on this narrow comfort zone of air conditioning, and the industrial spaces became more separated from the outside. However, for Soviet, the private spaces were increasingly sacrificed into a new socialist life, only centering around the Zhijian or the industrial quarters. But for Soviet experts, the large scale adoption of air conditioning in China was impossible, and while how to define an ideal climatic standard was more important. At the conference, promoting the climatic design in such a multi-climate country of China was highlighted by most of Chinese technocrats. Based on the modern climatology and physiology, a 7-zone plan was put forward at the conference. This was really different from the ancient Chinese imagination of the miasma in southern China, and also different from Republican China climatic consideration of public health, but a new focus on labor and productivity. Each climatic zone was assigned to different institutions. The SCIT took charge of the subtropical zone, Huanan Ligong, as I mentioned. Based on new devices for measurement, they visualized and rationalized the cooling effects of climatic design. For example, they found that the ceiling height was not the larger, the better, while the optimal height of air openings was just from 20 to 30 centimeters. Maybe we can understand why the roof height was reduced from 40 to 25 centimeters in Xiachangshi's climatic design. But for Maximov, this did not reply to the question of comfort standard, because reducing the indoor temperature did not mean comfortable or not. They realized that heat balance did not secure the feeling of comfort because people had extremely different capacity of thermal adaptation to surroundings due to their different genders, occupations, and customs. The Maximov and Soviet experts found that people in Wuhan had a much wider range of thermal tolerance than those in Canton and Haikou. Under the Maoist slogan of man must conquer nature, people always have the endless agency in defeating natural impacts. Here, people refer to peasants and workers rather than engineers or experts. In their field work across southern China, to their surprise, workers in Guangzhou and Wuhan said that they preferred the pooled fans rather than electric fans. For them, although the latter generated a stronger wind, the former created a more dynamic and changeable wind, making them feel more comfortable. This is what Schoff calls the comfort as achievement rather than naturalizing attribute, because of people's thermal agency in making themselves comfortable. These cooling strategies were promoted nationwide, like what British industrial physiologists called the greater sense of freshness of natural ventilation in the diverse thermal environment. However, it still draws the causality between thermal environment and industrial productivity. So it's still thermal socialism, as I said before. In the 1960s, China's tropical problems was no longer the unfamiliar similarity with the climate in Africa, but the over-design of cooling devices, even in the non-industrial spaces like canteens in Guinea, which was deemed as a weight of resources by the Ministry of Light Industries. The Commission of Foreign Economic Relations, or CFER, I called 对外经济联络部, was established in this year for a centralized management of all overseas projects of China. Chinese technocrat Fang Yi became the first director of CFER. To coordinate research activities, he worked with other state institutions to complete the design dataset for each tropical country, which should serve the China's domestic hot climates. Also, Chen Dengao actively introduced Western climatic design from Africa, but he sharply criticized the British intensive use of expensive aluminum shading devices on the building's facade. These sources were also included in the SCIT's technical manuals in Canton into a more low-cost and labor-intensive cooling system. For overseas practice, these subtropical studies like shading devices and comfort charts were included in BIADI's design dataset by Chen Dengao and his colleagues, as I said in the beginning. These low-tech cooling devices were reflected in the open envelope of Tazara railway station terminal, which was described by Western German architect Lipsmeyer as the Chinese pragmatic method, because he thinks that China's labor-intensive construction system was more suitable for African realities than his import-dependent techniques. Different from the British late colonial attitude of shutting out the negative tropical climate nature, Lin Qibiao from the SCIT advocated a more open attitude to topics as positive factors that should be managed properly for national regeneration. This open attitude and workers' manual labor in the hot climates were reported as cultivating socialist new men or 社会主义新人 in China, in both China and Tanzania. This network of transnational knowledge transfer was realized only through a highly centralized bureaucratic system of socialist state institutions as a map, from ministries to CFER, CABR, and SCIT. For example, the China-aided Friendship Textile Mill was celebrated as a milestone of Tanzania's industrial self-reliance. Even under the rural socialism policy, Tanzania still emphasized the light industries processing local cotton. Therefore, as the largest industrial complex in East Africa, China's work unit typology was adapted to Tanzanian soil. I was also told that in Dar es Salaam, the technical experts from different camps mostly saw themselves as part of the professional community and generously shared technical manuals with each other, even between Chinese, British, Soviet, Russian, East German experts. And the Chinese tropical climatic data benefited a lot from the British East African Department in Nairobi, such as the temperature and humidity tables for this textile factory. All this data and technical knowledge, in fact, were from British colonial engineers. Here, the climatic design was no longer the privilege for European communities, but also the necessity for African working class for them. However, compared with the Guangzhou textile factory, this Friendship Textile Mill was characterized as a further separation from the outside. In a new workshop typology without skylights, which was believed to maintain a more constant temperature and humidity for Tanzanian African textile workers' health and working efficiency. Since the microclimate of all workshops was kept within the comfort zone of China's domestic norms, in this ideal thermal environment, African workers were arranged to work non-stop for 24 hours every day in 3 shifts. Compared with the workshop, the design standards for the welfare facilities was much lower, as I said before, such as the cement bricks for the canteen were produced on site by local workers at a very low cost. The number of workers' housing was cut to only 1/3 of original plan of 1,500 housing units, and the investment was reinvested in the industrial construction. In many other Chinese-built factories in Tanzania or Africa, even the installing of the electric fans in the canteen was denounced as wasting the public resources, as I mentioned before. If compared with the East German construction in revolutionary Zanzibar, we can find they paid particular attention to breaking with the colonial past by providing the mass housing to improve the Zanzibari living conditions. They rejected the West German proposal of revitalizing traditional Swahili housing types and promoted an egalitarian living space in the uniform standard, different housing types only according to family sizes rather than income groups. Based on the British colonial climatic types of tropical Africa, the Soviet design experience in Central Asia can be promoted as a global model to adapt it to other hot climates by proving the adaptation of Soviet housing system to African social climatic conditions. This global transferability of socialist model was justified to transform Zanzibar into a centralized building industry under the planned economy and centralized urban planning system. In the Klimani housing, even the smallest flat was much larger than the largest one in the Friendship Mill, let alone the egalitarian provision of modern comforts like electric fans, electric fridges. This production first principle was also reflected in the Chinese experts' everyday life, in contrast with that of the Soviet counterparts, as reported by local newspaper and Chinese newspapers. As it was said by Tanzanian leaders, as an example, a great example, to urge African textile workers to work harder and harder to maintain the higher productivity by Babu, by Nigeria, by Karum, like this. This idea was not unidirectional, was not the unidirectional Chinese transfer, as I will argue, because it was well received by Tanzanian technocrats from NDC. The NDC requested a stricter labor management by Chinese experts. They even think it's not strict enough currently. However, this thermal regime did not always bring higher productivity, but growing tension between Tanzanian workers and Chinese experts. For Africans, the Chinese labor regime conflict with their daily routines or cultural customs or the laws by their labor union, while the Chinese denounced the African workers as lazy and irresponsible. Since such an ideal thermal environment was created for them, they were still lazy and irresponsible in the production. This also made Chinese technocrats rethink about the objectivity of socialist production. Are we just human machines for the state ambitions, or we are an end in ourselves? When linking the uncertainty of tropical world to the certainty of a narrowly defined quantifiable and controllable climatic parameters of temperature and humidities, people in socialist tropics were constructed as human motors or human engines or human machines with endless productivity, while the concept of labor was, of course, deprived of its social political dimensions and reduced to just a calculation of mathematics, of energy, of thermal energy and power. So today, when this thermal regime of air conditioning is taking command globally, I hope my story today could help us to understand how our current crisis of natural environment, of sustainability, of thermal comfort, of energy crisis, of sustainable development was deeply rooted in the history of China's two tropics. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sun, for your nice presentation. Another round of applause for Dr. Sun's presentation, please. So let us welcome Dr. George for our discussion, and then we'll allow other members to ask their questions. George, please.
Okay, great. Thanks, Zhijian. That was such a rich presentation. It got me thinking immediately about my own experiences of, I guess, kind of heat and class divisions. In Tanzania today, we finished on the kind of note of air conditioning and that as a kind of marker of class, to the point where sometimes you might enter a building in which the air conditioning is especially cold. I think that's quite a common occurrence, but not just as a kind of an energy-intensive issue, but a very much a sort of class-based issue. You contrast that with people sat under parasols on the streets, retailing, mobile phone credit or food or drinks, and that how even that kind of basic device of the shade is sort of itself bound up in sort of processes of advertising. These parasols are all handed out by big modern companies. And you contrast that again with the Swahili idea of jua kali, the worker literally laboring in the hot sun. Jua kali being a kind of synonym with sort of manual labor outside. And even to the point, and this is where I'd loop it back to the socialist era in Tanzania. So the question of what beer do you drink? Does that beer come cold because you can afford it to be in a sort of upmarket bar, or is it warm or even a kind of non-commercial Pombe beer? And if you go back to the 60s, you actually see some debates about this and politicians being accused of talking about equality in public, and then spending their evenings drinking cold beer rather than a traditional brew. I think what your paper does really nicely is introduces all these big concepts: thermo-colonialism, thermo-socialism, thermo-capitalism. I haven't really had time to sort of process them myself, but I think there's an awful lot to be said here. And I think what I like about them is it opens up a totally different conceptual approach for thinking about these questions. You know, historians working on the Cold War in Africa, global socialism, have talked a lot about ideology, but in terms that tend to reproduce those of the actors that they're looking at themselves. Yeah, and they often take for kind of granted these kind of categories and then work within them. Hence, you get in some of these kind of restrictive conversations about, well, was it ideology or was it some sort of pragmatic geopolitics and all these kind of artificial binaries that get built in. I think what you do really nicely is take us outside of that and get us to think of that afresh. And you do so because you're able to draw on these strands of environmental history, of STS, of architectural history. And yeah, I think that's really commendable and brings a lot to this project. Just a few questions and I think you hinted at a few of these in your slides, but maybe didn't have some time to expand on them. A few different ways in which we might talk about this. One is the sources themselves. You showed a lot of architectural plans. The thermo aspect aside, I'm kind of interested is there a kind of socialist culture built into these plans themselves? To what extent do architectural plans and the process of drawing them up, literally on paper, differ in China, in the Soviet Union, in the West? Is there where is the kind of transfer of skills here, and how does that adapt from case to case? Do you see the training of Tanzanian architects in China, in the Soviet Union, and can you see those kind of practices being transmitted through the process of drawing up plans? The answer might be no, but I think that was one way of opening that up. The other you hinted at this was the question of materials. Yeah, to what extent are Chinese planners having to work with not just different climates but different materials, and I guess the same for the Soviet Union. I think you flashed up a slide that was about the bricks and that the brick making scheme that takes place in Tanzania from the mid-1970s onwards, are trying to harness local resources rather than energy intensive concrete, something that Emily Brownell has written about quite a bit. And what are the implications of that for this idea of a sort of thermo-socialism? And that links me to the final question, which is about energy intensive practices. So Brownell argues that the Tanzanian state turns to promoting bricks made from mud in the aftermath of the oil crises of the 1970s, because it was simply too expensive to import concrete or to drive local industrial processes that were too energy intensive. The historian Joshua Grace, who's looked at the oil crisis, has talked about how Ujima, slightly paradoxically, is driven by capital intensive fossil fuel based development. Yeah. How does that kind of story of energy and its cost then factor into that story in the period into the 70s and into the 1980s? Okay, but it was a great paper, really enjoyed it, and looking forward to seeing more from the project. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. I think let's give like 2 minutes for Sun to respond, and then we'll allow other members to ask questions. Please, Sun.
Sure. Many thanks for your comment.
I think you need to sit there in front, because otherwise people in the chat online will see and hear you.
Yeah. I think these questions are really important and quite relevant to my research that I'm thinking about before, but I have not written it in my paper in this paper. I think about as to the drawing of the architecture plans, or so-called I prefer to call it architecture techniques. Techniques of producing architecture drawings like these. Of course, there was difference between Soviet, Chinese, and Tanzanian experts. I'm not quite familiar with the Soviet drawing of these, because you can find my sources on the Soviet and East German are based on secondary literature, right? Secondary literature, not the primary sources. But I know in Chinese production of the architecture plans and the drawings, exactly a class-based problem. Because in socialist China, also called in the 1950s and the 60s China, the distribution of heat is of course a political problem, not a technical problem. For the Chinese party cadres and officials, that some kind of jobs will require more cooling, especially the peasants working in the field and the factory workers working in the steel factories, steel works and textile factories like these. They will require much more cooling than other people, like the white collars, like the office, some party cadres sitting in the office. They believe that they don't need cooling systems. So the distribution of cooling in Maoist China is a class-based problem. And in the architecture plan of drawing, when they mark the function of these, for example, in the architecture plan of this factory, when they mark the office building, they will write 办公室 office in this architecture plan, and they will not draw the air conditioning conducts on this plan. So non-air conditioned building. While for the workshop, especially the textile workshop, for the cotton weaving, especially for cotton weaving and carding like these, they will mark textile workshop, 织布车间, 纺织车间 like these. They will draw detailed the air conditioning conducts and how the cooling air is circulated and how it was provided for the textile workers and which temperature the workers should have this kind of course, it's centralized, it's under centralized management. It's not decided by the workers. For example, if they decided it's 26 degrees, so all this workshop must be under the 26 degrees. And for your second question, I think it's currently a hot topic in architecture literature.
Please be brief so that.
Oh, sure. For now, architecture historians started to focus on materials. Just maybe in the since last year, they will see how the bricks, concrete, and like the steel or aluminum, like these materials, were related to local resources and economic systems and the transportation like this. Very, very interesting. It's new interdisciplinary turn in the architectural history literature. And for your third question, the energy intensive practice after the oil crisis, I'm not sure, but I hope to write more about these, especially how the air conditioning system of the friendship textile mill and the construction system of this friendship textile mill, I call it energy intensive construction because it used extensively use concrete materials and steel, right? Steel concrete structures. So I hope to know that how these in turn impacted the climate. Because now I show is how climate impact architecture design, right? But now I hope to show how architecture design in turn influence our climate, global climate in the southern world. Okay, thank you for your questions.
Thank you so much. I think we should probably allow. Thank you for your response, and I think we should allow first those colleagues who are following us online to ask their questions, and then, so please, you are allowed. Anyone following us online can ask the presenter a question. This is your chance.
She's here. Yes.
I said online first, and then.
Yeah. Good. That's right.
Yeah. No one?
Oh,
yes.
has a hand up.
I can see. So Kirsten, please go ahead. I think you are mute.
Yeah. I'm trying to navigate putting the camera on and the microphone. Thank you so much for your really interesting presentation. I'm interested in the kind of tropical brutalism, so the British architecture in that area, and have looked a little bit at West Africa. I'm afraid I don't know that much about Tanzania. What I'd be interested in is when Tanzania had to navigate and negotiate with Chinese experts coming in, Did your sources tell you something about whether that was a collaborative relationship, or so was there co-optation going on? So what was the influence about those relationships between Chinese experts introducing their architectural ideas and the Tanzanian people? I'd be interested if you could say a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think you can collect more questions and then we allow him to respond. There was another hand. Was it Dr.? Yes, you can go ahead. Yes.
It's me?
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Spoon, for your fascinating paper. I see the significance of your research because I'm also based in Baghdad, and these are very important issues for us here. I would like to ask you whether all these expertise you talked about and the plans and the work of your architects and civil engineers, if it left any lasting legacy in Tanzania in the way Tanzanian engineers or architects have been working.
Thank you so much. If there is another one, so at least we have 3 questions. Another one from online followers. If not, then I think you can respond.
Okay, thank you for this very interesting questions on collaborative relationship and the lasting legacy of the Chinese expertise. I think for me, for the first question, I'm also really interested in the British tropical brutalism in West Africa, the architectural styles of brutalism. As to your question about collaborative relationship, I think there were lots of kind of these stories. For example, in my study of the case of Tanzania and Zambia railway station building, the dome, the large dome roof of that railway station building, where I read the Chinese archives documents and the Chinese, it's a table of the Chinese arrangement of Tanzanian local labor. They will have the concrete workers, the timber workers like this. So we arrange the time of these different kinds of workers. They recorded that. It's by the Railway Ministry of Railway Design Institute, the engineers, but I don't know the name of the individuals, the names of individuals. They said that we did not take the dome roof typology of Beijing railway station that has already been built in the 1950s in Tanzania, despite the similar sizes of this roof for Tazara railway station and the Beijing railway station. They said because we have the industrial overcapacity after the Great Leap Forward, and because the African local labor was so cheap, so we have to use the local labor to make these cast inside reinforced concrete structure of this dome. Because for Beijing railway station, the dome was prefabricated under the supervision of Soviet experts. They planned originally to adopt this prefabricated structure in Dar es Salaam again, but they changed their mind because they found that we have so many overcapacity of cement, of concrete, of steel materials in China, within China. So we can transport these into Tanzania and use the local cheap labor to make the cast inside reinforced concrete. So this is, I think this should be the circulation, the translation in the process of knowledge circulation, right? The knowledge circulation is not just like unchanging from one place to another, from one context to another, like Haraway said, situated knowledge. I think this is an example of the situated knowledge, how the knowledge was circulated globally, but changed and translated by these local conditions. As to the second question, I think it's the lasting legacy is really interesting, especially as to my interview with Changzhou's experts who took over the friendship textile mill in the 1990s. They told me that the Chinese thermal regime of production over livelihood, or I call the production first, livelihood second, was still really dominant in Dar es Salaam today. When the Chinese proposed to transform this textile factory into the new development industry, like the housing estate development, it was strongly opposed by not only the NDC and the labor union, but also by Tanzanian government, because their government thought that this friendship factory is a production space. It should never be used for commercial purposes, even if it has bankrupted. And in a great demand for money, for investment, they rejected this proposal because they said we must process our local cotton, local agricultural products. Agriculture always should give the priority to. So I find Ujamaa socialism's legacy, we could still see the legacy of Ujamaa Nyeria's Ujamaa socialism and the Chinese thermal regime and the Chinese labor regime, right, of these. I hope this answers your question.
Okay, thank you. Any other members? Actually, now can allow.
We have a question in the chat from Nick McGee.
Okay, okay. Yeah, so I can read the question for.
Answer the question.
Yes, it said, if there is, here's a question. Okay, you mentioned a degree of disappointment from the Chinese side over the level of productivity at the compelled friendship textile mill. Did you find any parallel cases of disappointment from side of Tanzanian or other African partners in the delivery of functioning of any of these projects?
Yeah, there are several cases. For example, even during from Shanghai archives and some internal documents from 建筑学报 Architecture Journal, I could find that even during the design process, some African stakeholders, but I don't know Tanzania stakeholders means designer or NDC's technocrats, they highlighted that they highlighted the African tradition of outdoor living. So they were skeptical of these air-conditioned workshop spaces, these separated from outside, because they think that the African has a tradition of living outdoors, especially for Swahili traditional housing types or Swahili spaces, had a great emphasis on the outdoor living. So they were skeptical of the Chinese design of this separation from the outside. But finally, the design was still confirmed and decided by the Chinese experts. And from the Changzhou's documents, I could find that the Tanzanian textile workers were really unsatisfied with the so-called thermal environment, because they thought that it does not bring the real thermal comfort. For them, they find the waste heat from the machine, the textile machine. When the workers will stand next to the textile machine, they will feel the waste heat. And the air conditioning, in fact, is useless for them. They thought even if the temperature of the room, when you measure it, is 27, maybe 27 degrees, but in fact, when you stand next to the textile machine, it's almost nearly 40 degrees, but Chinese experts don't know this. Chinese experts just think that this environment is ideal, so the labor regime should be arranged for 24 hours a day. So, okay, so I hope this answers your question.
Yes, so please, Alex.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Sun, for excellent presentation. Yeah, I get a lot of new things, and I will question you also later. But I have a general question because in Soviet practice they also try to introduce traditional cooling architecture elements, like for Gulf states, Iran, all in Central Asia. There is these wind catchers, which are this I don't know how to say, towers or with holes, which at night bring cool air to the building, and during the day get away hot air from the building. I think they were also present in Zanzibar, maybe, I don't know for which houses, maybe not Swahili houses, but Persians or Arabs, I don't know. But did you find any interest by Chinese architects to these architectural elements? And did they try to think about how to implement them into their projects?
Yes.
Briefly,
Okay.
briefly, we don't have more time there. Be brief.
Yeah, sure. I have seen these kind of designs, especially in Central Asia and in the Middle East. The Soviet design will contain the wind catcher or the wind tower. Even in their design in Africa, in East Africa, they call these vernacular design elements or vernacular cooling systems. But for the Chinese, I think this is also a difference between the Chinese and the Soviets. Because for the Chinese, they thought this is not modern. they think this cannot show our modernity or our superiority of socialism over capitalism. I know the Soviets aim is to get the same sympathy with these local leaders or the local experts. But for the Chinese, they think that we should bring the cutting edge technology or the latest technology in our architecture to show that we are as modern as the West. The West, including the Soviet Union. Yeah, we are as modern as them. Them include the former colonial metropolitan powers, but also Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. Yeah.
Thank you. The last question, I think.
I'll just be very short. So it's more about how you deal with the Chinese sources. So especially in the 1970s, when you find some Chinese architects, they try to explain the certain ways of designing, certain ways of material. How do you really go against the propaganda against some presumptions? Because for example, we just mentioned, they think there are a lot of production of steel and cement in the Great Before, but according to my knowledge, the actual production of steel during that period is mostly unused. They are not good quality at all. Not only those produced in the backyard, but also those being produced in some factory, those still are not good. So mostly, I don't think they can export. So what's the reason? Yeah, they make design.
I know this is just a propagated reason, right? They say that we have industrial overcapacity of this, but in fact, in the Tazara railway station, the dome construction is not used the Chinese local steel produced during the Great Leap Forward, because in fact there's not so much steel materials here. In fact, they select the cast inside reinforced concrete rather than Soviet prefabricated. It's because that in producing the Beijing railway station's dome roof, they have already had this timber formwork. The timber formwork, they can use it again. So they could reuse the existing timber formwork of Beijing railway station and could just transport it to the Tazara railway station because the span is the same. It's 35 meters, the span of the roof. So they could reuse this, recycle this. They found it's more cheaper. It's much cheaper than the Soviet prefabricated system. So they use this.
Thank you so much. The very last question from Jody, please. Jody, you can go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can everyone hear me? Okay, great. It's excellent. I like the idea about thermal regimes. A very quick remark, I think, is opposed, to the idea about socialist. You use the term a lot, like tropical architecture in your theory and theoretical threshold. But my question is as opposed to post-colonial structure, because also you mentioned the kind of interactions between Tanzanians and Chinese, either workers or designers in their communication about how, what's the most suitable and best way to do that structure. Why do you stick to the term about socialism here? I know your cases, you're trying to compare the two, but I think it probably begs the questions, what's so socialist, right? And what's the other elements other than the socialist there? I think that kind of talks to George's earlier remarks about how ideology always been, there in the shadow. But I think in your case, it probably sometimes, I think using the ideology here hinders some of the important points you're trying to make, that in my mind is rather more than just socialism, but it's something else, right? It can be, post-coloniality, but it can be something else. So I think this is my kind of a bigger reflection about the terminologies here. But thank you very much. I learned quite a lot.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I totally agree with you that sometimes my use of the existing ideological terms will hinder my argument of the thermal regime. I think more, as you said, more precisely, maybe it should be thermal post-coloniality or thermal anti-imperialism. In my paper, in my published paper in History and Technology, I use the term thermal technocracy. Just like Victor Schell's book, Carbon Technocracy. But my use of technocracy is different from him. I think of course, it's not definitely socialism, this term, because it's so broad term. I think technocracy should be more specific and accurate, because it's like it's a rise of red engineers. It's an emergence. I will show the emergence of the red technical engineers in Maoist era. In Maoist era, the construction was not so-called crazy or ridiculous or like this under the Great Leap Forward. In fact, I hope to argue that it's technocratic. It's informed by modern science and technology.
Thank you so much. I think time's out, and please, a round of applause to the Dutch. Over to you, Thoralf.
Thank you. Yeah, I hoped I would be able to give people a bit of 5 minutes breathing space, but I think we need to kind of adhere to the time regime. So without much ado, I will introduce the second panel, which now looks at Soviet-Tanzanian relations, and I'll do a very quick introduction round before I hand over. So we have two presenters, Aleksandr Kondrashev and Vasily Starostin. Both of them are PhD candidates at the University of Hamburg, affiliated with the project and working at the Northeast Institute. And then we have two commentators, Ivan Sablin, who is an adjunct professor at the University of Heidelberg in Germany at the moment, also a research fellow in Ljubljana, and Gabriel Szymontowski, who I think are falsely associated with the Université Paris-Sorbonne. I think you are now a research fellow at the CNRS and an associate director at the Center of Social History. Hopefully that got it right. Having said that, without further ado, Alex, the floor is yours. We're really looking forward to your paper on Sino-Soviet economic, sorry, not Sino-Soviet, Soviet-Tanzanian economic relations.
Yeah, thank you, Thoralf.
Yeah, so I can use this, yeah. Hi, everyone. Yeah, my name is Aleksandr Kondrashev. And I joined to the project this April. So it's kind of, I want to present today a result of my first stage work of around half a year. As a starting new research, the first question you get always are sources. And I think that I am in quite interesting situation. I feel it's as an interesting challenge because of our how to say, funding procedures, and also because of my personal situations. Because of political situation, because of the ongoing war. This project is planned to study Soviet history, but without direct access to central archives of Soviet Union, which are located mostly in Moscow and partly in some other places in Russian Federation. So when I came on project, it was already planned to start work with the Central Asian archives, and I felt it as a interesting challenge. So I will just now talk short how I dealt with this latest months. So that's also interesting when I started, because I already studied Soviet history and Soviet foreign trade, but I wasn't studying Tanzania and Soviet-Tanzanian relations. And it's very interesting that, for one hand, when you start to deep into this topic, you see a lot of mentions of Tanzania and Soviet Union Tanzania. It's always there, but it's always, as in my name is the name of my presentation, out of focus. So there are a lot of very general descriptions of Soviet-Tanzanian relations, but you can, when you want to find more facts, more precise information, it's not very easy to get. Number of publications on bilateral relations are very limited, and most of them are published before 1991, so in Soviet period, 1970s, 1960s. Yeah, and there's always mentioned that there is an important cooperation, but it's very hard to find names, dates, projects, etc. Yeah, and yeah, about limitations I told already, and so my goal was to go to Central Asia. So yeah, this summer, from late spring to early autumn, I worked in two capital cities of Central Asia. One ex-capital city and one actual capital city, Almaty and Tashkent, both having yeah, national archives, national libraries of these countries. Yeah, and why Central Asia was chosen? It's quite obvious because for Soviet Union, which image presented Soviet Union to the Africa was that Central Asian republics are example for post-colonial countries, that post-colonial countries, for example, African countries, can follow the way which was already passed by Soviet Kazakhstan, Soviet Uzbekistan, also other republics, but these two were the most important, as the biggest ones, maybe most developed, better internationally connected. Yeah, so so there are not so much types of archives as, for example, in Moscow or in Russia in general. So there are mostly two groups: state archives, which have all state documents of Soviet era. So it's ministries, committees, etc. Every Soviet republic had own like government structures. So they were not independent states, but the system they had, it was very close to an independent state system. So when they become really independent, they just this Ministry of Internal Affairs of Uzbekistan became USSR became Ministry of Internal Affairs of Uzbekistan, etc. So yeah, so these documents are presented in Central State Archive of Kazakhstan and National Archive of Uzbekistan. Also there, that's interesting that officially non-governmental organizations which existed in Soviet Union, a lot of them, are really very strictly controlled by both state and the party, like friendship societies. There were also two-side friendship societies, like for Africa there was USSR Congo Society, for example, or USSR India, USSR Pakistan, etc. Many of them. Yeah, they are also in the state archives, and when you look the documents, you understand that it's really part of a state. But for external view, they were presented as a public non-government organizations. And the same with religious organization. No, the most important was SADUM. It's Muslim governing body for Central Asia and Kazakhstan. So it was centered in Tashkent, and there are a lot of documents in Tashkent about their activities. Yeah, party. There are also party archives, but I didn't work much in Almaty because it was my first. I was not no, yeah, I put my work on Central State Archive when I was there, and in Tashkent, unfortunately, it's absolutely unavailable. And there are also Kino, Photo, Phono, so-called archives. I will present them a bit later. So, so when you come there, when I came there, there are a few challenges to find because archival descriptions are very poor. The file can be named like foreign relations or questions of cultural cooperation, but inside you can find anything from I don't know, USSR, USA. You can find with Africa, etc. Also, there are access limitations, especially I face them in Kazakhstan. Everything concerned to economy was restricted to me, so I had to more work about on cultural and friendship society sources because they were much more available. And also the trade, because Soviet Union had a state trade monopoly, all or most interesting things about foreign trade, I think they are in Moscow archives. You can trace only some pieces of this. I also should mention that now Central Asia is a meeting point of different scholars for Slavic and Eurasian studies, who also because of this situation. So you can really meet a lot of different scholars who were not before interested maybe much in Central Asia, but they're working there. So also this community, it's what helps you to find what you need with the sport descriptions, etc. Because topics are overlap and people can share what to find where. Yeah, so the most useful I find the following files. It's Republican foreign ministries, because yes, USSR had the main Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but each of the Soviet republics also had one. They were quite small. They played maybe like secondary role, but anyway, when some, for example, Tanzanian diplomat comes to, for example, to Tashkent, it's always filed in Republican foreign ministry files. Economy ridden badges, yeah, and yeah, and they are very special. How to say? What you really can observe also is documents about foreign students, because there were quite many foreign students in both in Tashkent and Almaty, and the different bodies, they try to trace what's going on. So there are reports about some events, or even about how to say, rumors between students. There were documents about student protest of Ghana students in Moscow, for example. Unfortunately, I didn't find such interesting things about Tanzanian students. So, but this is very specific also topic, and I think it can be found in every archive of a big city of ex-Soviet Union, because foreign students were spread over the country. So what I find out, I try to organize it in this table. I would say that there are always two levels. And really, I put a focus on Tanzania as the highest level, but it's really much less represented. So most things you find, they are focused on Africa as a whole. So for actors inside Kazakhstan or inside Uzbekistan, when they put any action, or mostly it was aimed towards Africa as a whole. For example, they organized United Nations seminars about water management or about land management, and these seminars were organized for Africans. From every African country came one or two specialists, and maybe 20 countries present in this seminar. Yeah, and the same was, for example, events for African trade unions. So trade unions from different African countries come to Tashkent and consult with Soviet trade unions. The same with youth organizations. The same with publishing programs. There were many publishing programs which were, how to say, which should reach Africa, so they were translated in different languages, like a magazine Soviet Uzbekistan. So it was distributed in Africa, in French language, in English, in Portuguese, and in Arabic. No, it depends on which period this number changed. They started with French and English. Also, you can see that there was publishing activity in Swahili language, but it wasn't focused on Tanzania especially. So it was idea that we just publish some information about Soviet Union in Swahili, and it will come to all the region, Swahili-speaking region. Yeah, and the same with, for example, organizing visits, like visiting program to Kazakhstan or to Uzbekistan of any delegation was very, very standard. So it was not very important. Comes, I don't know, Americans, comes somebody from Czechoslovakia, comes African religious, for example, African Muslim delegation mixed, or comes young pioneers from GDR. They all receive more or less the same programs. They should visit production plants, like a factory, kolkhoz. They should visit one of the cultural institutions like theater, museum. Yeah, they visit Friendship Society. And also, how to say, reports about this visit, they are also very, very standard. So the most interesting is you can find sometimes the comments which they wrote that, for example, Tanzanian ambassadors said this and this about this, or they pay Tanzanians and Ugandians, they put a lot of attention on cotton industry and raised a lot of questions in working with cotton. Yeah, and diplomat trips were organized the same. So there are special visits of one country, but much more. You can see that, for example, different ambassadors come from Moscow to, I also can find documents about other parts of Soviet Union, to Ukraine, or to Tashkent, or to some Siberian part, and they have a program together. So it will be also ambassadors of different African countries. Yeah, and the same working with African students was also specialized. So they were specific work, but state students from Africa were considered as a whole group. So every year they celebrated in both cities some day of liberation of Africa. Sometimes another dates also considered to Africa. Or also the topic which united all Africans was to support African National Congress in South Africa and fight against apartheid. So you see that Tanzanians were not divided from Ghanaians, Ugandians, Senegalese, etc. And they were considered as a special group, and there were also special reports how, for example, in Tashkent is organized work with all African students there. Yeah, but there are also some, how to say, mentions about bilateral relations. I traced some exports to Tanzania from Central Asian republics. It's machinery, medicaments, also sending their specialists, doctors, cotton engineers, hydro, electrical engineers, and I didn't find exactly, but I think to work to geologists also. Unfortunately, I cannot access in Kazakhstan geology files. I was declined to get them, but I think that this is also productive. Also, there were bilateral relations with parties. So TANU and then CCM was partnering with CPSU, yeah, with Soviet Communist Party, and they paid visits to each other. And also, I know that Tanzanian party members, they can come also just for a vacation to Soviet Union, and it was paid by Communist Party of Soviet Union as a like. On diplomat visits, it's also interesting that I find documents of a visit of Nyerere to Tashkent. He never came there because he break his visit to Moscow and didn't come to Tashkent. But I can see that they prepared whole program. There is a list of people who had to follow him, etc. So this also interesting, how to say, point of view. Yeah, what didn't happen. Yeah, and no, there were some other visits, but doesn't bring so much information. Yeah, and another thing is like academical. The most you can find also, there was very important African seminar in Moscow, where was a point of meeting of African students and African students and doctor candidates. And they also, for example, sometimes travel to Central Asia altogether, specifically for these seminar participators. And also you can trace that there were tries to establish some African studies in Tashkent. There were no any special body for this, but there are a few dissertations, maybe 2 dissertations written in Tashkent University about Tanzanian history. Yeah, so and okay, I will come to this back later. So I think these pictures can illustrate the most of contacts. The most of contacts were 5 minutes. Okay, I will be very short. Were this official visits? So this is Zanzibar women delegation coming to one of the school of Almaty, and they receive some badges from yeah, maybe young pioneers of the school. You can see German, it's German class. Heute ist der 5. Mai. Yeah, and this is a visit of sorry, already CCM delegation to Tashkent in 1985. There are plenty of visits visiting different places. So this is a Lenin Museum. And only in the very early stage, like first half of 1960s, there were specific events on Tanzania celebrating Tanzania independence, or this is a seminar celebrating 1 year of Zanzibar revolution. And Jami Abdel, I think he was considered, I didn't prepare in this presentation, find the proof in my description, but I think I read that he was a participant of Zanzibar revolution. So like speaking, and it was also mixed of some Soviet officials, scholars, and African students. They were together in such events. Yeah, so I traced a few stories. So maybe if I have a little time, I will say only a few of them. One is this Professor Hidayatov. He was a professor of history and for a period dean of history faculty of Tashkent University. And I see him participating in every event of Friendship with Africa. Also, he is a doctorate student as Abruz, which I find only the dissertation. I cannot find any other data about her. Maybe she changed her name. Maybe she went out of Uzbekistan. I don't know. So, but she wrote a dissertation in about Tanzanian federation model, history of federation model creating Tanzania. And what was interesting, her defense was in autumn 1990. So it is a time point when Soviet Union was already collapsing because of national problems and because of its federation. And she raises these questions in her dissertation shortly, but very clearly, that she says that maybe Tanzanian model is more productive than Soviet model, how to make a federation. So I feel in these things that like it's breaking some borders. And Professor Hidayatov himself also, he was only person who I saw mentions Tanzania in public speeches. All other mention only like countries like Mozambique, Angola, and African National Congress. And he was the only who would mention socialism in Tanzania, speaking aside. Yeah, and very shortly, I also want, for example, the interesting story is we have very famous TV, how to say, journalist Elena Khanga. She's a very famous person in Russia. She is daughter of Abdullah Qasim Khanga, the first prime minister of Zanzibar, who came to Moscow. Yeah, and then, as I learned, he died in a prison because he was arrested in a treason in Zanzibar. Yeah, and like these stories show like how it can be very connected, connection between Tanzanian public space and Soviet one. Yeah, and okay, then I will skip all other stories. So my first assumptions. First, it's very hard to divide economy and ideology because economical, there were not so big economical relations, and when they happened, they were very ideological also. It was a part of kind of demonstrating friendship, etc. And interest was also, I think, both always sides. Yeah, as I said, Tanzania was never on the focus. Also, I can say that especially Tanzania, if you go to Central Asia, it's really hard to just find any trace of this presence. So we know it was present, there were these visits, but yeah, also when you speak to people, nobody remembers it and like this. So the bright point is these people who were not like following general line, but who had special interest towards Tanzania, as this Professor Hidayatov and his student who wrote the dissertation as a specialist, Africa specialist, or Swahili translators. These are people who like accumulated some information, some agenda in these bilateral relations. I think that in Tanzania there are similar people who have this experience too. Yeah, so I'm interested how much Soviet traces you can find today in Tanzania. It's my question, and I hope next year we will find it out.
Okay, leave it there.
Yeah, I just leave my questions so everyone can read them.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much, Aleksandr, for this preliminary introduction. Yeah, I mean, you could sit here, and I will yield the floor though to Ivan right away for the commentary, and then we'll put you up here again, us two together, to field all the questions. But first, Ivan, it's your turn. And you have to go here because otherwise nobody in the chat, nobody online will be able to hear you.
So thank you very much, Aleksandr, for this, first and very important presentation also of your archival field work. I find that you managed to achieve quite a lot in the difficult circumstances and the lack of access to some of the important archives. So, I mean, we already had a discussion in the morning today about some types of sources. I think that already the sources that you have, but also kind of preparation for further fieldwork could encourage you to experiment a little bit with different perspectives on the material that you already have, but also the material that you might find. I just want to give you maybe two examples. I will focus more on the second one, on the macro perspective, but first we'll start with my micro perspective. So perhaps what you could do is to find a concrete project to analyze and to find traces of this project when you're going to go to Tanzania. From my own personal experience with working with sources, I think the CIA documents provide the best access point to get a list of projects and then start working from that list. What's quite interesting here is that artificial intelligence, ChatGPT in particular, has become quite handy in working with CIA materials. Now you don't have to look through individual documents, which often don't have OCR, but you can ask ChatGPT or Microsoft Copilot to look specifically in the CIA databases and return you a list of projects completed with, I mean, going country by country, with USSR aid, with Czechoslovak aid, with GDR aid. And then once you have an executive list of projects, you can find traces of one of these projects or several of them. So that would probably help you structure this material. Because, I mean, speaking of delegations, Tashkent was a major focal point for them, right? So then at some point, if you have a list of projects with maybe some people that you know participated, and then you can cross-reference that with their visits. And then you can say, yes, that this visit was important, or this student was important, this experience in Soviet educational institutions was important because it led to that project or another one. I mean, what I could find, in CA documents related to Tanzania is, for example, a tannery, a ceramic plant, hospital and medical facilities, housing project. I mean, that's famous one, right? But that's mainly done by GDR. Then I will switch to kind of the field that connects our fields of research, kind of the macro perspective. And I mean, we already started talking about that, but I will just go very briefly through several waves of Soviet engagement with Africa, and also we'll try to decentralize the Soviet part in that a little bit. So, I mean, we have what we can call charm offensive of the early 1960s, when the Soviet Union tries to demonstrate an alternative way of building modernity. Here, for example, one of maybe possible entry points also to the Soviet bloc would be the inclusion of Mongolia, because Mongolia, as being a country outside formal USSR, was in 62, I think, I saw an article from 62 about discussing how Mongolia could become the blueprint for post-colonial development. But also, of course, there is Aleksandr Yandelov's book, Arrested Development, which shows that this was very much an idealistic project in the beginning and an attempt to, precisely to jumpstart modernization. Then we have somewhat a gap between, let's say, mid-60s and early 70s. And this is very interesting in the case of Tanzania, because this is when Arusha declarations comes, and this is also when the villagization project starts. So there, however, we do have some research. I don't know if you already went through Africa and Asia Today and Peoples of Africa and Asia. So in Asia and Africa Today, there are 17 articles on Tanzania. And also one of the main, let's say, Oriental studies scholars, Alexei Kiva, he wrote dissertation in 68, where he wrote about African socialism. So here, I think, kind of, we have a gap in the Soviet clear position on what, how to engage with post-colonial states, also because of the economic crisis in the Soviet Union itself. But also, it's when the phenomenon of African socialism becomes important. And given the Sino-Soviet split, there is the big question, of course, what does this African socialism mean? Is it another, let's say, heresy deviation from the Soviet model? Is there hope for these programs, or is it a version of Maoism? Again, another angle, I mean, this is not part of this project, but that's, of course, the whole engagement of Tanzania in the non-aligned movement at this time, with very similar, ideas about having a special type of socialism coming from Yugoslavia. And then, of course, we have the pragmatic shift in the 70s. And I mean, we already discussed that in the morning. So, but something that we didn't discuss is the division of labor within the Eastern European members of the Soviet bloc. So, again, maybe this could be accessed in a similar manner as another book that, if you haven't seen yet, I would recommend Radoslav Yordanov's Our Comrades in Havana. It is a very, very nice study of all Eastern European Soviet bloc countries and their engagement with Cuba. But there you can see also an early kind of roadmap for archives, specifically, again, GDR and Czechoslovakia. Finally, kind of the big debates from the African side. So how to define a socialist Pan-African vision, or in case of Tanzania, that's East African vision. Here, I would especially recommend Frank Garrett's book, The Ideological Scramble for Africa. I think that's by far the best study I read on African intellectual history. It's only the first decade after the Second World War, but it is very, very nuanced study of different approaches to the future of Africa, also with focus on Tanzania. Finally, so the whole failure of the village program. Kiva, the guy who wrote the dissertation on African socialism, he wrote a denunciation article in '74 on how basically Ujamaa failed. But what was the takeaway out of that coming into '80s? Did it mean that the kind of failure of the non-class, non-Marxist Leninist version of socialism would push Tanzania to cooperation with the Soviet Union? Was there intensification of relations? Or did it mean that most likely, Tanzania would go to the capitalist world? So what was the expectation there? So basically, finally, I mean, if you haven't read it yet, Jeremy Friedman's latest book, Ripe for Revolution, has a chapter on Tanzania where this interplay predominantly between Chinese and Soviet development projects is shown, because, I mean, he's a specialist in Chinese studies, but perhaps also you could find some literature on the Yugoslav angle on this. So otherwise, yeah, congratulations on the first very successful fieldwork research.
Thank you so much. So I will answer maybe to.
Yeah, I think we'll just sit here together, because again, you need to sit here, otherwise
I
you lose
understand
the people online. So quick reply.
Very quick. Thank you, Ivan, for this how to say ideas. About concrete projects, it's interesting because I find kind of a list of projects, but not in archive, but just in some publications. So I have it, and I also wanted to find something on this project in Central Asia, but unfortunately I didn't. Maybe also because of this restriction in Kazakhstan, because geology, I couldn't access anything. And I think it was, maybe it is there. And also thank you for different perspectives. Some of them I already had also in my mind, just I didn't want to bring it to presentation to shorten to my field work. But I also would say that non-allegiance movement, it brings me big interest, because I think that ideologically for a first period in Yere was an important player together with Tito, with maybe Cubans in this organization, and I really would like to study about it. Just I really didn't yet deep into how to study it. Is it already published by someone, or should I find and where are archives of non-alignment, maybe in Belgrade? I'm not sure. And thank you for many interesting historiography advices. I think that there is a bright context of different research touching Tanzania, as I said. So I feel my goal also to combine ideas of different scholars and try to prove them or to check how it works in more precise Soviet-Tanzania study, because most of them are much more broad and they bring Tanzania as a case.
Brilliant, thank you so much. I think I will follow the path that was so carefully mapped out by Andrea, and we'll take questions from the online audience. I think I want to thank, first of all, Olalekan. I think that's a very good piece of advice. So the use of newspapers. So he's recommending, she's recommending the use of newspapers. So newspapers, I don't know about the situation in Germany, but in Britain, some of them at least are available in the British Library. So, that would also be a trip that, you might want to make. But we have a couple of minutes, maybe not as long as with the previous one for discussion. So are there any questions or any kind of comments and suggestions to Alex, beyond what we've already heard?
Ask for question in the chat.
Yeah, That's the idea. So is anyone in the chat, does anyone in the chat have a question? I mean, we can maybe close the PowerPoint and then see if we have the whole range of the internet audience. So what do we see? Any questions at the moment?
Yeah.
That was earlier.
No, yeah. Anything at the moment that you'd like to ask?
Christine, for example.
Yeah, Christina, please.
Hello, sorry, take a slow again. Thank you so much. It's so exciting to start a new project and to think about how to do it and ponder all of the questions. So I thought that was really interesting and it's super how you're going about exploring. I was wondering, have you considered United Nations archives? Because what I'm interested in, what I've found is this, I can see that you're interested in the Soviet side of that relationship, but you know, when you're in your first question, I think you're you're asking how to study unequal relationships, and so maybe looking at the role of Tanzania and how Tanzanians have interacted with this actually does shed light on on how the Soviet Union or the USSR at that point did that. So I was wondering that might be something that's interesting to specifically look for, Tanzanian sources rather than USSR sources, but also maybe extending a little bit, because the USSR was actually quite excited about the kind of multilateralism, at least at the beginning, and wanted to form it in a particular way. So that might also give you a bit of an idea of the direction of where you could go. It's not a question, it's a suggestion.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. And I think it ties in nicely with Konstantin's question in the chat. What about the archives of the Baltic countries? So, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's all things I thought about, and we already in an internal discussion also discussed it a bit. Yeah, United Nations, I brought a great interest after working in Tashkent and Almaty, because I think that these republics were really involved into this Economical Commission for Africa of United Nations and FAO programs. And what they did was really sharing the real what specifically these republics can bring to Africa is because it's the most arid zone of Soviet Union. So water management was very important, and breeding cattle also in such a climate, also a big question. So and also cotton. Cotton is an important resource for Tanzania and also for other African countries. And Uzbekistan was the main cotton center of Soviet Union. So now I would like to know this or that different way, how in United Nations it was processed. Yeah, maybe I will study it myself, or Thoralf also plans to work in United Nations archives, as I understood. So maybe we collaborate here. And about multilateral, yes, I already made the first check of GDR records in Berlin, in Bundesarchiv. And yeah, it looks very promising, because East Germans wrote very extensive reports about not only GDR Tanzania, but they mentioned they have special blocks, Soviet Union, like news about Soviet Union Tanzania, about GDR, about China and the United States. So there are these 4 blocks. So I hope to continue this. And with Baltic states, that's also true. The idea first to go to Central Asia was that it's most like distant trip. You cannot get anything online there, because these archives, they don't provide any online services. So I already checked Tallinn archive, and I have one file. It's about, and it's also an interesting topic which I didn't mention, is perestroika, because there was a visit of parliamentaries of Tanzania to Soviet Union and to Estonia in 1987. And Estonia, I think, was chosen as the most, cutting edge perestroika republic, which was the fastest change in its economy to these new ideas. And also what I find in Central Asia that this SADNA, Soviet Association for Friendship with Peoples of Africa, they really activated their activities in perestroika period. And they really planned a lot to cooperate, to send missions also to Tanzania, other countries, to provide, to inform them about perestroika ideas. And also Tanzania was at this moment already, how to say, turning from socialism as ujamaa to some different way. So I think maybe it will be, I hope I can find material for one chapter about this late Soviet, a reform in socialism, trying to keep something both in Soviet Union and in Tanzania. And also in Baltic states, there is very interesting movie. It's available online. I can share a link. It's called Jumbo Tanzania. It's filmed by Kaunas. It's a Lithuanian documentary films studio. And it is really like a message from, I feel it when I watch it, as a message from Nyerere to Soviet Union. Because half of this movie is interviews with him, and also they showing this ujamaa, how to say, farms, yeah, these villages where they work, how they work, and explaining this idea and explaining about party, etc. So when I watched it, I felt that, yeah, these Lithuanian filmmakers, they were like providing this feedback or bringing a message. They're like ambassadors from Tanzania to Soviet Union because there is nothing about Soviet Union, only about Tanzanian socialism, which is quite rare. Mostly in Soviet Union, every message about Tanzania was in context of Soviet Union. And this is the rare case when you just learn only about Tanzanian attitude to socialism. So maybe I think this Lithuania is also good direction to dig more.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. George, is that a question? I think, and then we close the floor after that question. Yeah. So keep your very quick thought, yes.
It's a very quick point. I think you're always gesturing towards that in your presentation and in some of the answers, and it doesn't just give you maybe a thought for the project as a whole, that this working in the Central Asian archive has been prefaced with that we can't go to Moscow, so we've gone to these kind of substitute archives. But I think what you're sketching out is something that's a lot richer than that. And that actually is asking you to think about the Soviet Union in quite different ways as an international actor in Africa. And I think you can afford to be slightly more kind of confident and creative with that, rather than saying, oh, we've had to change our plans, and actually what we're doing isn't really what we want to be doing. I think this is much more original, actually. And I'm much more excited reading about this than someone else who's going back over some quite well-trodden material in some ways that's been made available in Moscow. I think on thinking about that shifting relationship between a certain part of the Tanzanian party elite and the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe from the 70s onwards is quite interesting as well. I think this has been really overlooked, that there is a younger generation who rise in Parliament and Zhijian who do not have their kind of formative experiences in the late colonial or even very early post-colonial period, but under the conditions of stress that the Tanzanian economy is facing and incorporating all sorts of kind of radical ideas from around the world, take a much more explicit Marxist-Leninist path. And there's this kind of struggle within the party in the late 70s and into the 80s. The amount of delegations who are going to the Soviet Union, from my sort of impression from looking at some of this, increases during this time. Some of them are quite high-powered. There's a CCM delegation that goes to Romania when the Ceausescu's fall from power, and they come out with these kind of incredible reports about what they're witnessing. So there's this kind of counter that sort of against the grey movement that's going on as well. That I think it's really interesting. I had something else I was going to bring up.
Okay, quickly, Brian,
if I have time. Yeah, thank you. For first, yeah, I feel it's also like challenge, not like it's a problem, but it's a new approach for me, because most of historiography is based on like Central Committee of Communist Party in Moscow, but it's not Soviet Union. It's just few old people, which were many jokes about in Soviet Union, and the experience of Soviet Union is much broader. And all engineers, doctors, it's like who really did the job, or translators. So yes, just the challenge was that I find not so much evidence yet from for cases there, but I think that when I find it, it will be very interesting because it's not about official report. It's about like field work of these people. So I really share your feeling about this. And about parties, that's really interesting. I just because I'm only half year in the project, I didn't have a chance much to study history of the party and in Tanzania, but it's really what I want to do. And also I started reading your book, but not yet finished. And the same with some other nice books. There's so much literature. So I hope in a year or two we will discuss it one more time. I will bring more interesting insights.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I think we've already had some interesting insights, so I think you're very much on track. So thanks again for your contribution. And without much ado, I'll hand over to Vasily, and I think who is relying on the power of the word and not offering a PowerPoint.
Yes, hi. So my name is Vasily Starostin. I'm a PhD student in this project, also in the Northeast Institute in Lüneburg. My PhD thesis is going to be on the Soviet soft power in Tanzania and let's say their cultural relations. And the cultural relations between these two countries. I started my work in July, and the idea for this presentation actually came also from a trip to Tashkent in August. Unfortunately, during that time, I couldn't get get access to the archives, but because you need to get government approval. But thankfully, I finally got it, I think, last week. So hopefully, it will be used. So hopefully I can use it, of course, for a later trip, which I'm planning also to do. And this sort of idea for this paper, for this presentation came from working in the National Library in Tashkent, which holds extensive amount of documents, dissertations and Soviet Uzbek publications, which also include Africa. And and so without further ado, I will start. So in this presentation, I try to trace potential connections between Tanzania and the Soviet Union through the lens of the Tashkent International Film Festival. Originally, it was launched in 1958 as the Afro-Asian Film Festival and re-established later, 10 years later in 1968 as a recurring event. And the festival became a key platform through which the Soviet Union presented itself as a partner to newly independent countries of the global South, promoting ideas of anti-colonialism and cultural solidarity. My focus is on how Tanzania was featured within this space of exchange in the Soviet and Soviet Uzbek press, which is really important. Tanzanian participation was mentioned only occasionally and usually as a part of a broader discussion about African cinema, and rather than as a distinct subject. By examining periodicals and library sources from Tashkent, I try to identify traces of Tanzania's presence, explore how these moments were represented, and consider what they might reveal about Soviet Union's cultural diplomacy and its imagining of Africa. Of course, as I said, this is not intended as a comprehensive account, but rather as an attempt to map the fragments that exist and to consider how a seemingly minor case like Tanzania can illuminate the broader mechanisms of representation and soft power operating within the festival. So yes, as I said, I have primarily worked with press materials where Africa appears frequently, but Tanzania is mentioned only briefly. As I said, my next step will be to consult archives in search of more concrete information about Tanzanian filmmakers, who they were, how they came to Tashkent, what kinds of exchanges or collaborations may have taken place. Even minor traces in correspondence, festival records, or institutional reports could help clarify these connections. What is the Tashkent Film Festival? So the film festival emerged as a significant cultural political institution in the Soviet Union, arguably second in scale only to the Moscow International Film Festival, and was designed specifically to showcase and promote cinemas from the global south. It provided a rare international platform for emerging filmmakers from Asia, Africa, and later from Latin America. Beyond its role as a venue for screening films, it can be said that the festival functioned as a multifaceted transactional hub, facilitating everything from informal film exchanges to formal distribution arrangements. It also enabled delegates to acquire films and other cinematic materials for integration into state-led educational programs, national broadcasting systems, and cultural diplomacy strategies. So in this sense, Tashkent became not only a site of aesthetic recognition, but also as a tool of soft power. For many newly established national film industries, particularly those in African countries that gained independence at the turn of the 1950s and 1960s, the Tashkent Film Festival became an important platform through which they could seek financial and institutional support to continue developing their national cinema infrastructures. Tashkent suited this role for several reasons, not only because of its historical and cultural significance in Central Asia, but also due to its symbolic value in Soviet cultural policy. Uzbekistan was presented often as a model post-colonial republic, illustrating how a once backward region could be transformed through social modernization. This image served to promote the Soviet development model to audiences in newly independent countries. This idea in the 1957 publication, we have seen Soviet Uzbekistan, which I encountered in the National Library, offers a clear example. It features curated accounts by foreign visitors intended to highlight the Republic's progress. So the quote, the former colonial periphery of Tsarist Russia, Uzbekistan has during the years of Soviet rule, transformed into a truly independent state, a Soviet socialist republic with its own territory, constitution, legislation, coat of arms, and a flag, and a member of that unprecedented union of nations in which every people, great or small, is equal among equals in the fraternal family of free peoples. This kind of image making would soon extend into the cultural sphere more formally, as seen in the following year's film gathering in Tashkent, which was organized under the banner of Afro-Asian Solidarity. And also it's important to mention during that year also there was a meeting of writers and literators from the world, which is also which was, I think, even a more significant event in that year, of course. So the inaugural festival defined its purpose as fostering mutual familiarity with the works of cinematic art from the countries of Asia and Africa and promoting cultural cooperation, peace, and friendship among the peoples of these countries. The festival inclusive principle enabled young filmmakers from Ghana, Vietnam, and Morocco to participate alongside more established national cinemas. It reflected an early Soviet effort to position Tashkent as a symbolic crossroads between the socialist world and the decolonizing global south, combining solidarity with emerging nations and projection of soft power through cultural diplomacy. However, it's also important to note that even though the 1958 Afro-Asian Film Festival in Tashkent is often seen as a starting point for Soviet cultural engagement with the Global South. In practice, it was a limited and short-lived initiative. It wasn't until 1968 that the Tashkent Festival took shape in a sustained and institutionalized form. By then, the Soviet government has established the Union of Soviet Filmmakers, which expanded the festival's reach and organization. At the same time, many African nations had gained independence and begun developing their own film industries, making broader participation possible. Several participants were graduates of GIC, the old Soviet State Institute of Cinematography, which would become regular figures at the biennial festival. A notable example would be the Senegalese director Ousmane Sembene, who was a GIC alumnus and a key figure in post-colonial African cinema. My current research is based mainly on Soviet press publications from the Tashkent National Library. It holds an extensive collection of material both from Moscow and Tashkent, covering the period from 1968 to 1988. These include local newspapers and journals such as Kino, Tashkent, as well as Moscow-based periodicals like Искусство кино, The Art of Cinema, and Asia Africa, Сегодня, Asia and Africa Today. The library detailed card catalog arranged by topic was especially useful, and it helped me find relevant issues quickly without having to look through each one individually. These sources offer valuable insight into how Soviet writers and critics viewed Third World cinema and the festival's role in promoting Afro-Asian cooperation in film. Unfortunately, so I still hope to get to the archives to find documents which might include correspondence, delegate lists, film submissions, and internal reports that would offer a fuller picture of Tanzania participation and of the festival's broader cultural diplomacy efforts. And I have, so talking about information about Tanzania, fortunately, it's quite limited. And the most detailed reference comes from the 1972 festival, when Tanzania actually made its first official appearance there, with the documentary film Tanganyika, the Promised Land. There was a review in Искусство кино which described the film as sincere and promising, though still technically modest. So the critics wrote the following: we must admit that the film's merits struck us both appealing and important. A focused, consistent observation of reality, the effort to reconstruct it vividly and truthfully, the careful attention to small things and details that make up the fabric of life. All of this should in time lead to higher forms of creative cognition, to the comprehension of contemporary problems, and to the search for an independent cinematic path. However, it would be naive to think that African cinema is moving forward by its own slow evolutionary path. Such a path, usually measured in decades, characterized in development of cinema in the older countries of Asia and within Africa, only in those with long cultural traditions, for instance, India or Egypt. That is why the vital sources of the future Afro-Asian cinematography are to be found in the films born amidst the struggle against imperialism and colonialism. Their creators studied the art and technique of filmmaking not during peacetime, but between battles. Traces of timid amateurism and naive fascination with the suddenly discovered possibilities of the camera are still visible, yet in the spontaneous creative impulse of anti-imperialist cinema, one can already discern clear signs of maturity and talent. This kind of commentary shows the general attitude, I think, of the Soviet critics towards African and Asian cinema, a mix of genuine admiration and somewhat paternalistic outlook. Unfortunately, after 1972, mentions of Tanzania become even rarer, although their participants is listed in official catalogs from 1974, 1976, and 1980, there is almost no discussion of it in the press. So Tanzania's role at Tashkent seems to be mostly symbolic, included under the idea of Afro-Asian solidarity, but rarely talked about in detail. But I also found interesting that in 1974, Tanzania participated with a film called Afimbo ya Mnyonge, A Poor Man's Salvation, filmed in 1973. It was their first produced feature film, made during the villagization campaign with the support from the Danish government and Danish filmmakers. I couldn't find any reviews in major Soviet journals, which I found a little bit odd considering that 2 years earlier, they gave more space to amateur-made documentary. Although these sources help to show how the Tashkent Film Festival functioned as a site of cultural diplomacy, and although Tanzania's participation was limited, it still formed part of the larger Soviet effort to frame African cinema within the global story of anti-imperialist socialist cooperation. So also at the moment, I've been looking at work of other researchers about the Tashkent Film Festival, including Rosen Jagalov, Masha Salaskina, and Elena Razlogova, who write about it as both a contact zone and an economic political project within the socialist world. And their research helps frame how film might have worked as a connector across socialist and post-colonial context. And I want to focus on a more specific zone. So it seems important to follow the line of the of Soviet-Tanzanian cooperation to see how these relationships actually functioned and where their interests met or clashed. And that the film festival feels like a key point to trace this, a space where those networks came together and became visible. At the same time, it's also crucial to look at the formation of Tanzania's independent film industry. Scholars like Dr. Mona Mwakalinga from the University of Dar es Salaam, Dr. James Brennan, and James Burns are really important. They discuss the creation of the Tanzania Film Company and the role of censorship in Tanzania. And building on that, it's worth asking how Tanzania's film scene fit into the broader socialist world, what role Soviet connections played there, and how much space there was for actual collaboration. So after Tanzania's independence, the industry inherited British colonial structures, which were then reshaped to fit the new socialist government and the Ujamaa vision. Film, like most things, became a state-controlled tool, part propaganda, part education, and part experiment in national identity. So the researches I've been looking at also show that Tanzania received a lot of financial and technical help from socialist countries, not just from China, Cuba, the USSR, and the GDR, but also more socially democratic countries like Denmark and Finland. This already suggests that support wasn't only ideological, but part of wider international development efforts. Going back to the documentary, I've been trying to find more about it, but only answers I've come across were that it probably wasn't screened outside the festival because it wouldn't have been profitable. And in the newspaper coverage I've seen, most of the Tanzanian participants are the people representing the Tanzania Film Company. And for example, the president of the TFC appears there quite regularly. And I had like one quote that caught my attention because, it was a quote from Clem Nreshegauzi, sorry for my pronunciation, the director of the TFC. This quote was published both in the journal Kino Tashkent and the newspaper Pravda Vostoka. He says this: I'm here because I have been instructed to acquire Soviet films. Very different films such as War and Peace and The Diamond Arm are enjoyed by audiences of all ages in many countries around the world. I would like to introduce viewers in our country to Soviet films of various genres: adventure, historical, comedy, and popular science. All of this will allow my compatriots, including the youngest among them, to better understand the world. I think one of the things that caught my eye in this quote, because it was published differently in the journal, it was published like completely, but in the newspaper they decided to take out the phrase "I am here because I have been instructed to acquire Soviet films," which I would find a little odd. Also, another thing I managed to get my hands on are notes from the Ergali archive in Moscow. It's a note dated June 12, 1972, so I think after 1 week after the festival had ended. It's called Reference Notes on the Sale of Soviet Films to Film Distribution Companies in African Countries. It lists Tanzania as among the buyers and says that Tanzanian State Film Organization bought 10 Soviet films for 4,000 rubles. And also an entry in the same file mentions a conversation with the president of the TFC, which I quoted earlier. The report says that he was very reserved and careful when talking about topics not directly related to film distribution, but he didn't show any hostility towards the USSR or dissatisfaction with the cooperation. It also adds that there was strong Chinese influence in Tanzania, and at the time, and around 15,000 Soviet specialists working there. So just a small note. Moving forward, I want to look more closely at the economic side of Tanzania's participation, especially the role of the Tanzania Film Company, which started out mainly as an import and distribution agency. Unlike other African cinemas that were, celebrated at the Tashkent Film Festival, like Senegal, Nigeria, or Morocco, Tanzanian films didn't get much attention from the Soviet critics. They weren't highlighted in festival reviews or positioned as the part of were positioned as a part of third world cinema canon that Soviet cultural writing often tried to shape. But despite this lack of artistic recognition, Tanzania kept showing up, and their delegations were present regularly. I think it makes it reasonable to think that for Tanzania, the festival might have functioned more of a space for negotiation, for buying films, making deals, or building institutional ties, rather than for showcasing cinematic excellence. It would be useful to look in the Uzbek archives to see if there's any trace of these conversations, meetings, agreements, or mentions of co-productions. And just as importantly, the Tanzanian sites needs to be explored too. It would be interesting to see how the TFC framed these trips, what kind of outcomes they reported, and whether these events were seen as opportunities for cultural exchange or more as practical business trips. These kinds of records might help build a clearer picture of how Cold War film diplomacy actually worked for countries that weren't in the spotlight, but still were part of the system. Thank you.
Thank you for this really interesting, intriguing presentation. I'll hand over, I think, with immediate effect to Gabriele, and looking forward to your comments.
So thank you very much for your presentation. Hello, everybody. A special hello to Kostya in Baghdad. As you showed us, the film festival in Tashkent is a fascinating case study. And you didn't show us some pictures of the festival, but there's so many. I don't know if some of you saw how all those actors and filmmakers who went in Tashkent had some specific sociability moments with people from Tashkent. They visited the town with the people, but also on the scene of the main theater in Tashkent. They were all in a traditional dresses, and there's a lot of pictures. It's Tashkent, the film festival in Tashkent is really a showcase of how the Soviet Union wanted to show, to be represented as one of the main actors of the assistance of for third world development, but also an important actor to some artists to express themselves by with the cinema. But as you said, and I will come back later on this point, Tashkent was not a very good film festival. It was much more a place to connect, and it's why our colleagues Masha Salaskina and Rosen Jakov say that it was they qualified this festival as a zone of contact. And when you read all the critique of journalists who have been there, I mean, French journalists, British journalists, I mean, Western journalists, but who were communists from left. I mean, from the left side of on the political scope, they were all very critical. They are very critics of the festival. They say that they saw only some bad movies, really. And most of also African former students who have been trained in Moscow, with whom I did some interviews, told me, okay, you know, you come in Tashkent to meet with people from Africa. You will not meet in Africa, but you meet in Tashkent. So it's really a contact zone, very important. So from my point of view, such case study as you mentioned, so about Tanzanian Soviet relationships during the Tashkent Film Festival could nourish several historiography. Very briefly, I will mention two, but we already talked about it this morning and also this afternoon. So the first one is the history of African cinemas. And I will say this is with the is because we usually are speaking about African cinema, but as with the idea there is just one cinema, but there's so many ways to make cinema in Africa that the plural is very, very important for me. So why this topic is important to nourish the history of African cinemas? It's because as many African countries, and I already said it this morning, have not preserved films. And there is not film archives, or there is some film archives, but very poor. For several reasons, because also they didn't preserve the documents regarding film development because of war, because of political change, etc., etc. The transnational perspective here with Soviet sources contributes to write a social history of film development in Africa. Indeed, during a very long time, scholars were interested much more in doing in studying films themselves, or some famous filmmakers, but they were not interested in such questions as how filmmakers have been trained first, or how they received funds to make films, how and where films have been screened in their countries, in which language. I already talked about it this morning. Who was the main movie viewer, etc., etc. And all these questions are very important to nourish this social history for African countries. So all these questions stayed understudied from my point of view. So as you said, for film workers, Tashkent Film Festival was a place to negotiate, really, to negotiate agreements with Soviet institutions. And from the Soviet point of view, it was the place to send Soviet films, really, to be sure to just identify who are these social actors in film distribution, in film exploitation, to deal with, to spread Soviet films in their countries. So Tashkent has this aim, really. So it seems to me that Tashkent Film Festival, and you mentioned one guy, led you to enlighten social actors for film distribution and film production were very often ignored. So it's already, if there are few, it's sometimes a point of the beginning of broader research. So I just also I would like also to say that Tashkent Film, the Tashkent Film Festival, helps us also to identify some films. So you talked about the film. Let me see, The Promised Land. It's very funny because this title is a very common title. I mean, for many countries in the Soviet Union. I mean, I think that each Soviet republics have a film entitled Promised Island. And I think that there was also at the time in the 60s or 70s, many African countries who had also this kind of films with this title. So the title is not Tanganyika, the Promised Land, because I check in the list of the festival. It's just the Promised Island. The Promised Land.
Actually, if I can make a small comment, I saw two names. It had two names in Soviet publications, and so I think they called it in '72 like one, and then one way, and then like starting from '74, '75, they called it like this. Yeah.
It's a point very important. It's the problem how to work on these sources, because there's a lot of mistakes. A lot of mistakes with the name of African actors. I mean, social actors. I mean, for example, I just check also in a paper regarding the third session of the Tashkent Film Festival. They told it was written that Med Hondo, who is a very famous French, Malian, Mauritanian filmmaker, he's qualified as a Tanzanian filmmaker. So there's a lot of mistakes in all these documents, so we have to use it with a lot of precaution. But things anyway, you can find some films that are not in Encyclopedia of African Cinema, so you can identify some new films also. It will be my second point. It's about how to decolonize Soviet history and how to decolonize the way we speak about this cooperation, and to see to make a micro history of this festival. Let us also to observe some new actors, Uzbek actors, for example, and to study all this non-formal sociability between local actors and these African actors. I will just give you an example. I did an interview with a Sudanese filmmaker, Suleiman El-Nour. He was an alumni in VGIK in Moscow in the 70s. He had been in Tashkent, and he told me that so he arrived, and some Uzbek people during the festival offer him a soft drink, and he said, is it not possible to have some alcohol? And the Uzbek said, but you are Muslim as we are, and it's a common point between you and you and we. And say, yes, I'm coming from a Muslim country from Africa, but I drink alcohol. And he told me, okay, there was this impression that we are sharing a lot. And I think that the religion is something we didn't talk at all since this morning, but it's so important. And so suddenly there was a wall between this Uzbek from a socialist country and this Sudanese filmmaker coming from Sudan, from a Muslim country, but much more straight in the way of life regarding a religion. He's a real communist from his point of view, you see? So just to study this sociability, because during an event as a festival, there's a lot of sociability during a dinner, during the visit, and you can really doing some interview, maybe because the report is a report. I mean, so with interview, you can try to really explore how this concrete sociability describe another history. I mean, up to their ideology. Maybe I will stop. Yes, just one, just information. So Sam Van Oosman is not an alumni of GIC. It's what you read in many papers. And he was trained under with Kostya. We wrote an article, and also with another colleague, Françoise Blum, about the Soviet links of Sam Van Oosman with intellectual, with the Society of Writers in the Soviet Union. He spent 6 months in the Soviet Union. He was trained by Mark Donskoy in the studio, but he has never been in the University of GIC. So. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Gabrielle. Right, so if you, Vasily, would join me for, and I think I really want to keep this short so that we can have a break at 5 past and then have 15 minutes and then we'll reconvene. We here in the room certainly have earned our coffee break now, and you online probably want a bit of rest as well. So a quick response to what Gabrielle said. Is there anything that you want to add? And then we have time for a couple of questions.
Yeah, well, well, no, it's not so much as a response as thank you for the additional information, especially the last part, because I think all the publications I read about Ousmane Semban that says that he's also a GIC alumni. And of course, like before that, because I've read a lot of articles from the 70s and 60s. And he's given like a lot of he has like a lot of publications about him, and he's always portrayed as like our guy, because our guy who studied at GIC with Mark Donskoy.
It's because of himself. I mean, Sam Van Oosman said that he was he graduated from GIC, but it's not true.
Okay, yeah, but thank you very much. So it's
great. I think again we're trying to work our way from online into this room. So are there any questions on the okay, Christina, in the interest of time, I wonder if soft power is a helpful concept to use for the direction this research project might take. This is just for pondering more than it needs an answer. So yeah, so that is something to.
Well, I'm pondering on that every day.
Yeah. Let's ponder a bit further. Yeah. Are there any further questions, interventions, comments, suggestions?
Just wonder which month is the film festival in Tashkent?
It's end of May, early June, usually.
There's a writer conference, Afro-Asian writer conference, also in 1958 in Tashkent.
Yeah, but it was in 1958. It was one time. It was a one-time thing, and I think like I think that sort of the original festival of 1958 was. I think it was sort of formed there as an idea. It's like semi-continuation of that of the writers meeting, but it held a completely different function at that time. Yeah.
Great. Yes, I have. Sorry, maybe start with Andrea, then Alex.
Yeah. Thank you, and congratulations. It is a nice talk and nice beginning for a project. Yeah. I was wondering, did you find because you said this was highly funded by the Soviet Union? Did you find a similar project being funded by the Chinese side as a means of competing one another?
I think they were involved. I think that China was involved in the first festival somehow in 1958. But from researchers I read, I think in Dragal's book I read that they wanted to get more info, wanted more influence in the organization of such festival, but ultimately failed to do so. So it's I haven't heard I think of any like Chinese organized film festivals of the same genre.
Or maybe outside the Afro-Asian movement, did you find the Chinese doing the same thing, sponsoring I mean those film festivals maybe in their way? As
Unfortunately, I haven't. I'm not sure. I don't know. I mean, Eastern Asian cinematographers appear at the festival, but it's mostly. I think it mostly focuses on Japanese filmmakers and Vietnam filmmakers. I think Korea sometimes is also there. But but China is like completely left out.
Okay.
Because of course I think of the competition.
The last thing, because you also said you read a dissertation by my colleague and said some of the like training and other things were even provided by the Nordic side.
Yeah.
The countries also need the same. Did you find the same? The Chinese doing the same, offering maybe not festival, but maybe offering training and such kind of a thing.
Unfortunately, I haven't studied and looked too deep into the
maybe if you can also find that kind.
That would be really
I think I need to be radical now, and you have 3 minutes for question and answer.
Just a short comment. It doesn't need any answer because we discussed it already with Vasily, but I also find it interesting what Gabriela said that, and I read in documents that there was a representative of Soviet film export company in Dar es Salaam, and I really wonder what was his job, like daily job to do, and I think it's just this film distribution, which needs a person to be present in the country whole the year. It's interesting how did it work. And maybe context of other countries could be useful for that.
Brilliant. Shall we wrap up here? Then I think we have all earned about a 15-minute break, so we'll all be back at 20 past, if that's okay. So get even 2 minutes more, and we'll then continue with the roundtable. Thank you so much. Thank everyone.
Well, it's been a great afternoon so far. It's been so interesting hearing about the development of everyone's work. As I was saying, I'm so impressed that people have just started their PhD, have so much to say already. It's been lovely to hear about that. I should say I'm Poppy Cullen. I'm one of Thoralf's colleagues here at Loughborough. I'm not working on the project, but I have great interest and have been cheering it on from the sidelines for a few years.
You were one of our most important advisors.
Well, there you go. So, an advisory role, clearly, to the project. And this really is a chance to try and, I think, pull some of these strands together. Should we introduce ourselves for people online, do we think? I think if we could maybe just go along and everyone can introduce yourself, your role on the project for those of you who are or what you're doing that's connected.
Yeah, my name is Kirsten Bönker. I'm one of the PIs of the project together with Thoralf. And beside of that, I'm the director of the Nordost Institute, the Northeast Institute at the University of Hamburg, based in Lüneburg.
So, hello, I'm Gabriela Szymantowski, and I'm a research fellow in the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris. It's also affiliated to the Sorbonne. And I'm working on how African filmmakers have been trained in film studies in different socialist countries during the Cold War.
My name is Ivan Sablin. I'm teaching at the University of Heidelberg in Germany and also leading a research project on Soviet and Yugoslav engagement with post-colonial countries in Ljubljana in Slovenia.
Hello everyone, my name is Xiaoyang Chen and I just joined Loughborough to our team as a research associate this month. So I just dipped into this project. So previously I'm trained as a social and gender historian of modern contemporary China. And this is first time trying to get more into the Sino-African relations. So I really look forward to learn more from everyone. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Andrea Azizi Kifyasi. I'm a historian from the University of Salaam in Tanzania, and I'm a co-PI of this project. Thank you.
Brilliant. All right, so I've been given some instructions by Thoralf, which he shared with us all, that really the idea of this roundtable is to think about some of the challenges and some of the ways of bringing together the two sides of this project. So the sort of Sino-Tanzanian relationship and the Soviet-Tanzanian relationship, and how to bring those into dialogue, how to synthesize some of the results of that. And I'll start off by throwing out one suggestion that seems to me to have come from a lot of the papers this morning that we've heard about, is ideas of modernity and modernisation. I was also thinking of Frank Gerritz's book, where he talks about the struggle for anti-colonial modernity, and that seemed to me to really be coming through from a lot of the papers in kind of quite different ways. So that's my opening suggestion. But I think maybe it would be useful for each of you to perhaps just reflect, to start with, what do you see as some of the connections, the potential ways of bringing these into dialogue together? It's a big question to start with, but I think we should start with the main question that we have. Do you want to start, Kirsten? We can move along again.
Okay, yeah. I really am impressed by this question, because the question of modernity is as important as huge and complex. So I actually have no real answer to it. But, yeah, I for myself would push or give on the question to the experts of China, because I have no idea what the concept of modernity was handled in China, and how it was handled in the relation towards Tanzania. For the Soviet Union, I think we can say that there's a lot of research on the concept of modernity, for not only for the Soviet Union but also for the East Middle European socialist country, and this was for sure a very, very important concept which directed all the socialist states towards a better future with which better consumptions, possibility of consumption, with a better way of life and so on. It was for sure one of the most important aspects, I would say, regarding the relationship towards the global South and the developing countries from the perspective of the Soviet Union, to show them how the way to a better future would be like if they follow the Soviet path. And then we are heading towards the question of competing socialism again. So it would be the question, what was the concept of modernity like in China? What this is aspect of the competition, that they presented another way of modernity, another way of modern life, and another way of, modern, whatever modern might have meant to this. I don't know, I push it.
I was so struck this afternoon when Jody asked Zhijian's question about whether it's really called thermal socialism or thermal post-colonialism, and also when you actually said the modernity in China. So I was thinking, what's modernity in Chinese? I mean, after 1980s, there's a lot about modernization, the 现代化, that has become a very key political and also economic drive for China. But before that, I would say in the Maoist period, modernity, the 现代, does not really be mentioned a lot. Of course, they will say we are in a new period. We are going to this 新时代, the socialism new period. But it's nothing related to that. They will use modernities. And modernity seems to be really linked with capitalist society. Yeah, so, I mean, of course, if we use modernity as an analytic category, that would be different. But I was just thinking, I was also just intrigued by how should we define that? Do they equal that they're offering a alternative modernity to African countries, or they are just so stick with the socialism, Chinese socialism? Yeah, but I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I'm in the same line, but before subscribing to what you have said, I was thinking about if we say that during the Mao period, modernity was not an issue, which of course I agree. What came on my mind was, how can we say about the institutionalization of traditional Chinese medicine, which started, I mean, I think in the mid 1950s, where they introduced, those colleges, and it became mandatory that for someone to qualify as a traditional Chinese medicine practitioner, then has to go to the college, get trained formally, so that you can practice. So maybe we can still think about that. If there was modernity during Mao period, or there was not, maybe it was, but in certain aspects, and this was allowed to go for modernity, and this was not allowed for modernity, based on the political atmosphere of the time.
I would like to add a piece for what you said. The filmmaker from Mali, Souleymane Cissé, so trained in Moscow, and he received his diploma in 1969. His graduate film was about a student in medicine in Moscow who learns with a modern technique to be a doctor, and he's fighting with himself because he's seeing in a dream his father telling to him, "What you are, you forget what you learn as a traditional medicine. You were used in Mali in your village." So it's a fight for him to choose between modernity, medical modernity, or traditional modernity, and he felt so bad to have to choose. And the film is about this issue also, to choose between modernity he discovered in the Soviet Union and what is his traditional life and traditional medicine in Mali. So I mean, there is the ideological, the high level, and also on a low level. I mean, we really from the ground with the people, what they felt about this speech about modernity. It could be also another entry. I don't know if
Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, sure. I would probably focus, on the process of modernization and development or development, and then just start with maybe 5 very short questions and look not only into the Soviet and Chinese, but also Tanzanian perspectives. So the first question would be for what? So what is the goal of modernization and development? What will have to emerge at the end of it? Not only for policymakers, but for practitioners. So what are, let's say, Chinese engineers and Soviet, let's say, teachers? What are they trying to achieve? And then also how? I mean, is it coerced? Is it voluntary? If we're thinking about the villagization project, then by whom? But also for whom? Is it for an abstract organism of the state that, for example, the copper deposits need to be reached by railway, or is it for the benefit of the people who live along the railway line? And finally, at what cost? I think this is also an important question, both for policymakers, but also for participants who are making this decision. Should I go and engage in this project? Also, at what cost do we accept the aid coming either from the Soviet Union or China? So I would say that, baseline, just these roughly sketched questions, maybe a couple of other questions, and then draw in the 3 strains of literature, the Soviet developmentalist kind of literature, Chinese developmentalist literature, and also literature specifically focused on Tanzania can kind of help get some kind of a baseline. And of course, I mean, given the amount of literature this is something, of course, that I'm very cautious about when talking to my students, but of course to colleagues, I can say there is, for example, the Google Notebooks AI developed for academics, and you can upload their 50 monographs and ask these questions, and it will give you kind of some baseline with page numbers. And then, I mean, just saying that, just kind of getting a very basic idea of where there are intersections.
They can even generate podcasts based on that.
Yeah.
Great points, everyone. I'm really glad you brought up the Tanzanian perspective, because that's also what I was thinking about, kind of Tanzanian ideas of modernity and how other Soviet models or Chinese models might be seen as useful for developing particular ideas of that. So that was my starting point, but I think it would be useful to hear what other ideas of convergence you all have between these two different strands. So you want to go first, have links that have come to mind from you're thinking about this, researching this, or conversations today.
I found it very interesting that Christina raised the question online on the concept of soft power, and as this is a helpful concept, as she put it, and I think we could also think about questions of the zones of contact that were created. It was mentioned several times. When I hear the concept of zone of contact, I would think of Mikhail Bakhtin and his concept of hybridization, so that there are two different voices that meet or speak to each other, and then something different, a third voice or third space is created. So one question would be, is the zone of contact only bilateral between the Soviet Union and Tanzanian actors, or is this a contact zone between all three groups of actors, I might say so? And what does then happen? Or are there two zones that merge with each other? So how can we conceptualize this? What happens on the site, what happened in Tanzania, and also what happened in the Soviet Union when the delegation came to Tashkent or wherever, or when they came to China. I think we didn't hear anything about Tanzanian delegations to China, didn't we?
Yeah, but there are many delegations to China since the 90s.
So perhaps we could trace.
And recently, Dave Monson has published an article
okay.
on the female delegates going to China, tracing back from I think the late 1950s.
Perhaps you could trace these questions of methodology a bit.
Yes, I'll get to read the article, so I don't know the contents of the paper, but it's in that line.
That would be quite interesting. I would like to read that, because I think when I was hearing your presentation, when you mentioned about there would be different youth organization, women's organization, religious, probably not. I guess there will be not religious group in visit China, but women's organization, how do they become a contact zone, or like a youth organization? How is it? So I would be quite interested to see this kind of comparison.
A small comment there, because when we were in Tashkent looking at the archive, we actually found like an interesting women's seminar in 1962, and had also an interesting lead, because one of the organizers from the Uzbek USSR, I found a small piece of her biography, which also later said that she moved to Berlin, to East Germany, to continue working with on this topic. So it's also a point that I want to dive in later, try to expand upon that.
I think the contact zone is a very interesting idea, and I think one of such contact zones was also mentioned today in the morning. So international fora where multiple sides meet, where there are Chinese, Soviet, Tanzanian, but also further presence from state socialist countries, but also from post-colonial countries, and kind of to see also at coalitions being built there, also conceptual coalitions, other sides speaking the same language. What I also picked up from Jeremy Friedman's work on Tanzania is that Zhou Enlai didn't think of Ujamaa as being socialist. When he discussed it the first time, he just mentioned anti-imperialism the whole time. Self-reliance, he didn't mention socialism once, right? Whereas for the Soviets, this was all about socialism, but only their own kind of version of it. It was all about socialism. And that kind of fits into this, stereotypical understanding of how Chinese and Soviet internationalism were different, right? For Chinese, the priority was anti-imperialism, could be socialist, but not necessarily. And for the Soviets, yeah, it has to go into this socialist direction, and class struggle and so on.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point of that. And I think contact zones is a really good way of approaching this. And as you were saying, seeing if there are people who are engaged in both relationships and how they are reacting to those would also be interesting.
I mean, speaking about those international conferences, I will just show you to Andrea, there is a website, it's by Bristol University. They have this called Afro-Asian Network, when they kind of lined, like from 1945 until 1960, all major Afro-Asian conferences. And they have a list of where those delegations come from, who are they, and you can see actually some people who attended multiple times, like attend maybe the second Afro-Asian Solidarity or some others. So I think that'd be quite useful they try to visualize it. So it's quite nice website.
From what university?
University of Bristol. So it's by Rachel Lowe, who is in Cambridge, and then I guess you will know, as a pop, you will know that. Yeah. It's called Afro-Asian Network.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. What other contact zones, modernity deals about this? What other convergences and people join in as well, because I think there's few enough of us that we can all collectively contribute. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to continue. I also spoke about that. I think that interesting topic is reforming socialism in 1980s, because China made a lot of economic reforms. Soviet Union tried to do economic reforms, and it was also political and other spheres. And Tanzania made reforms, and for sure we know that China and Soviet Union were tracing each other and were like exchanging also ideas and to build their own way. And I think that Tanzania can be also brought to this perspective, because anyways they were interested in experience. As I said, they tried to learn about economic reforms in Soviet Union, for example. I'm sure that they learned what China does. So I think this can be a good also point. It's maybe not about building socialism, but about reforming socialism when it was already something is already existing.
Yeah, I think that's a point that I'd really like to second, that we need to think about, neither modernity nor the contact zone as a kind of a fixed kind of scenario, a fixed framework, but that is actually quite fluid, and that we probably need to look at both kind of how that evolved through time. And it's really interesting. So I've done some research in Chinese archives, and one of the things that came out, especially when it comes to delegations, is that they are either expected to or confronted with the latest political change. So they need to know how bad the Gang of Four was, for example. They need to know about reform and opening policies. So that's already kind of built into that. And then the other thing that we need to think about is really kind of the levels of contact. So I haven't read, I mean, I know Shadow Cold War, but I haven't read the new book with the Tanzania chapter, which I really need to do, I think, really as a matter of urgency. But my feeling was that in the previous book, this was really much more about kind of ideology, about kind of theorizing socialism, and about these kind of, international conferences, Afro-Asian solidarity conferences, and so on. And I think that's part of what we need to do, but then also we need to look at, I think the much kind of lower levels and the kind of people-to-people exchange. So one thing that I still have in mind from my initial engagement with the nationalists, so the leading, not in terms of its circulation, but of its political standing, the leading Tanzanian newspaper, was a Chinese women's delegation visits Tanzania, and the Chinese women hand their counterparts cash, pick up cultural objects, kind of Maasai cultural objects. And I was wondering what that signifies for the way that Chinese conceptualize Tanzanians. This is much lower levels. So I think that's the kind of thing that interests me, and the kind of the people-to-people thing. And therefore, I think contact zone is really basically kind of it's an open door for me already in a way. So I'm really grateful for you bring that up, because I think it is really useful to be looking at it in this way. I absolutely, I'm really grateful to you there for that.
Anyone want to play next? And I it's not online, but is there something moving? Go on. You didn't say something?
I just want to react to have just idea about object also. This woman who bought some object in Tanzania. There is many current research projects about here history of militant history through objects. I mean, in France, there is maybe 3 or 4 collaborative projects about how to think the history of social how militants use objects, for example, during demonstration or during meetings, political meetings, and what these objects, how did the objects circulated in the space and in the time also. And I'm also thinking about this colleague. She's, I think, in Amsterdam. She worked a lot about her PhD was about Indian films in Soviet Union, and her second research project was about how Indians who have traveled in the Soviet Union use their objects, matryoshka and other typical Russian objects when they came back in India, and what does it mean now? This nostalgia about the USSR through these objects. I'm not sure that I'm clear, but so there is. I think it's some fashion trend in research to work in. I mean, through the objects. That could be interesting.
But this would also speak very well to the question of the circulation of knowledge. Also, the circulation of knowledge, of objects, of ideas. So and so on. So it would be also interesting to ask if there was kind of way that knowledge circulated from the Soviet Union to Tanzania and then way back to China, or the other way around. So, might be there. Don't know.
I don't want, to be a lawyer or Friedman in this regard, but I think that he does go a little bit beyond this level in this latest book. And actually, that this discussion just brought me this idea that he does discuss one particular type of objects, and these are like small farming appliances that are to be produced by a Chinese factory. And that's where kind of this conceptual misunderstanding comes about, because they're both saying we need self-reliance. From the perspective of the Tanzanian side, self-reliance means producing farming appliances which are cheaper than the ones imported from Britain at this time, and which are, better, of the same quality. What the Chinese side offers is something that would be of inferior quality and more expensive, but it would be locally produced in any possible quantity. And there is a lot of back and forth precisely on this, on what does it mean to be self-reliant based on, you know, sickles and other very, very, very basic metal equipment. And in the end, the factory is built. And it is kind of somehow put into this kind of concept of self-reliant together, but it's kind of an intersection between something very abstract, what does self-reliance mean, and something very concrete. Something.
Question for Andrea.
Yeah.
Yes, what is the Swahili word used for modernity?
What?
The Swahili word for modernity. Someone is asking in the chat.
Maybe this Swahili word for modernity, maybe because if I say Ustara is a civilization, but it has a link to that. But when you say someone is Ustara, it means it's more advanced, more modern. Yeah, maybe something like that.
Yeah.
Proceed, yeah. I think we interrupted you.
Yeah, listening to you, I'm just remembering that you know there's a lot of joke in some different countries of Africa.
Modernity in Swahili can be for usasa, kisasa. Yeah, but that's more correct than what I said. So you can say usasa or kisasa.
Okay.
Yeah, just I'm thinking there's a lot of joke in different countries in Africa regarding tractors, about all objects and things of the modernity who have been sent by Czechoslovakia, by Soviet Union, maybe by China. I mean, I don't know. Have you heard about this joke? As I mean, for example, in Mali. There's a joke saying that, or in Guinea, yes, we received 20 very, very new tractor and they didn't work. I mean, there's this kind of joke with which is circulated in the memory of the people about these objects were modern but didn't work. So you have, in theory, it's so nice, so modern, but the efficiency of the object is just zero. So I'm just wondering, first, what is the memory of this object in Tanzania? Andrea, could you say something about, I mean, from Tanzania, what are the rest of this presence? What is, I mean, as heritage of this Chinese or Soviet presence in Tanzania today? I mean, is it only you as historian who are interested in, or is there some place of memory from this presence? Is there really some object of this memory? You see what I mean?
Yeah, I got it. I think it's an assignment. We have to do that. Yeah, I don't have an answer now. But maybe I just wanted to contribute on a very important point you raised on the question of self-sufficiency and the knowledge exchange. Because the Soviet Union and China both provided technical assistance to Tanzania and many other countries in the global south. And the agenda put forward was to promote self-sufficiency. And you see, you know, when you read what the Chinese side was saying, or just saying the training that the assistance provided by those from Soviet Union were not really promoting self-sufficiency. So in one way or another, trying to raise some issues regarding, for instance, on the issue of interest rates on the loans provided by the Soviet Union to some African and non-African countries, that it was higher. And on what the Chinese did was to lower the rates, to somehow differentiate themselves with the Soviet Union. So maybe when we collect data, we can, based on the projects they funded to Tanzania and other places, we can try to find out how this appears in the files, and or both did the same thing, but rather raising claims, or in one way or another, you can find some differences on the way in which the Soviet Union and the Chinese approached the projects they funded to the country. Yeah.
But I also find this really important because the distribution of knowledge, this sounds so positive. And for the Soviet Union, it wasn't positive to distribute such bad technical equipment to the global south. And they really were aware of it. I read many files in the Economic Archive in Moscow, and they were really aware because they always complained. They got many complaints from African countries, from Asian countries. They all complained about the quality or the not existing quality of the technical equipment the Soviet Union delivered to them. So, and this was a really disadvantage for the Soviet Union. And they at some point they said, okay, then we don't want to deliver much more.
A small commentary. It's the same. You have the same commentary from the Soviet people.
Yeah, sure. That's for sure. That's for sure. But and there was also a huge gap between knowledge and objects are not always the same, and there was a huge gap in the Soviet Union what they could offer in theory, and they could offer knowledge in the sense of African students could come to the Soviet Union and study and require some knowledge in techniques, in medicine or whatever. And this was so to say a positive transfer or positive distribution of knowledge. But the practical side for the equipment and the production side was quite bad.
Yeah, and maybe to draw a few examples from what I was studying on Chinese medical teams, you see, knowledge was provided, and maybe medical equipment were also provided. But the problem was those objects or those medical equipment, for instance, were instructed in Chinese, and therefore local doctors could not use them. So it was a problem. The other thing, when I was studying on the pharmaceutical industry, which was also sponsored by the Chinese, is that machines which were installed were not compatible to the hot climate in Dar es Salaam.
Yeah, sure.
So they're supposed to start now to think about purchasing other machines outside China. Yeah.
Even though, I mean, I think it depends probably on the project, but what I learned from this person who worked on the Tazara Railway is that they basically tested all their equipment in Guangxi. So very analogous to what Zhijian said, right? So they tested all the equipment in China's tropics before they actually used them in Tanzania. But I think this thing about language is a nice bridge to another aspect of the contact zone or the non-contact zone or the contact on a rise zone is, of course, that there are potentially different ideas about how things are done. And I think I would like to learn a lot more about that in terms of kind of the Soviet side. So this one thing where I have really looked at the material and where, the Tanzanian bureaucracy gets completely frustrated is that the Chinese have different ways of arranging shipments than the Tanzanians. So the Chinese basically do everything in bulk. They export everything. There's a Chuanpao, so a whole set of a whole factory, and they basically ship that in one shipment in bulk. And the Tanzanian authorities want everything itemized, and that's a little detail, but it causes a lot of frustration. Because if they're not itemized, we cannot basically pass them through customs. We cannot put them on a railway to basically transport them to the construction site. So these are these little things where this something that's really kind of fascinated me for basically, I think, in my entire career. When people come together that have this very different idea of how you actually do things, and this is a nice a nice illustrative example of, you know, how people can talk past each other, or, you know, there are expectations on one side that are not met on the other side. And that in a way kind of feeds into, you know, both in what you said about, as I said, you know, Friedman must read now, and also into the idea of a contact zone, because I think when we think of the idea of a context, especially when we look at Mary-Louise Pratt, I think it's no, I think she's not saying that, you know, that there are no prejudices, but I mean, she has this idea of, I think, seminar rooms. She's wrote an article about, you know, seminar room as a contact zone, where you know, people share ideas from kind of very different angles, but that really people can talk past each other is, I think, not so much, you know, part of her theoretical makeup, but I think it is an important part of, you know, these kind of cultural encounters, you know, that are happening here also, right?
Yeah, I think something else that I'm just going to jump in on there, but something else that will be really interesting to see from this, I just occurred to me from your point about language, is how Tanzanians are talking to the two sides and whether they're doing this quite differently. And also potentially, I know it's not really part of the project, but how that differs to Tanzanians talking to Americans or the British or Canadians or other partners that they're also working with. And I'm thinking particularly this great article on Botswana's non-alignment by Jeffrey Byrne, I think, where he talks about how Seretse Khama, when he talks to the Americans, he says, yeah, we're all about freedom and human rights and so on. And when he talks to the Chinese, he says none of that. And he says, we're all about anti-colonialism, just like you. And he's very cleverly pulling on the tropes that are going to work. And of course, Nyerere will be doing that in all kinds of ways here, and other Tanzanians. So I think that will also be really interesting to see.
Yeah, so one thought, because like when I started researching on this project, I think the first topic I started reading was about Tanzanian students in the USSR. And now, you know, after working in the archives in Cambridge last week, I sort of had the feeling that it's also important to keep in mind that not only the context with the Eastern Bloc or Chinese Bloc, but also I think it's sort of important to keep an eye out on the context with the Western Bloc and how, for example, of course, Tanzania, I don't know, for example, how did they work with the UK? How did they work with the Federal Republic of Germany? Because I think so. I mean, when I started researching this topic about students, thank you, Konstantin, if you're hearing this really insightful work. There were a couple of moments that I was actually surprised, because I think I read, if I remember correctly, there was a storyline about engineering students who were sent to study in the Soviet Union, but the machines they actually got came from the Federal Republic of Germany. So this was also a line that I thought that it's actually would be quite interesting to look into further, because there are so many connections also here, and and I think that could also maybe, like, from the viewpoint of a contact zone, that would be also interesting to research and to look into further.
Yeah, I think to add something on what you said is, I think it's a good point, and you can probably go further by examining the ways in which these graduates, either from China or from the Soviet, were perceived by their colleagues who went maybe to the UK or in the German and other parts of in the global north, and whether it was easier for them to get employment. Because in my case, when I was studying about Tanzanians who went to China for MD training, they were not recognized even by the Medical Council of Tanganyika, so we would not get jobs. Yeah. So I don't know for the case of those who went to Soviet countries, whether they easier got jobs or not, because in those days I was mainly focusing on those who went to China. Yeah, but the thing is, you find out that there was a stereotype that those who went to colleges in the government, I think they thought themselves superior and more skillful than those who went either to China or other countries in the Global South. Yeah, so
it's also an important point that Nyerere himself was I think the first Tanzanian to graduate from the English university. It's also interesting.
I would like kind of to continue a little bit into another kind of dark side of modernity that we came to a bit today, but the whole armaments, weaponry, and military training, because this was a major point of contestation between Nyerere and I think the Americans when the Chinese instructors were invited to the Tanzanian army, and then I think even bigger scandal when I think like 7 or 8 Soviet instructors came to the Tanzanian military, and Nyerere even like lost his cool when he was talking to some Western
Romanian. From Soviet Union or from Romania?
From Eastern Bloc.
Okay.
But he like I think at some point yelled at Western ambassadors that, you know, like these 8 people and you are making such a fuss about this, right? But then again, I mean, the whole issue of weaponry. So being modern also means being able to defend independence. It's not just becoming self-sufficient in economic terms, but also becoming self-sufficient in military terms. And I mean, there was this conflict with Uganda, yeah? So I think this is another point, like where would Tanzanian government be interested in purchasing armaments from? And then if you purchase armaments from somewhere, you automatically establish dependency because you need the munitions, you need the servicing of these armaments. Of course, I mean, this is a major export from the Soviet Union, right? And this is at least some type of equipment that is in some cases so simple, like AK-47, that it doesn't break. So this is like the selling point, right?
Yeah.
Can I continue a bit the idea of Ivan? I think that another interesting point, and it may be interesting from Chinese perspective and from Soviet perspective, is support of military, military fight in Africa, because Tanzania was also a hub for training for Zimbabwe national movement, for Frelimo Mozambique movement, for African National Congress. So I know the Soviet Union used Dar es Salaam just as a place where they deliver arms for these countries. And also I read an interesting fact that even in 1987, they provided economical help to Tanzania as a front country near the South African conflict. So they even thought that they have to support Tanzania itself because they host this I don't know how to call it, guerrilla movement, liberation movement. Yeah, and I think China was also involved in these relations. So I think it's a good point, which also colleague George Roberts' work can also be applied here.
Thoralf has reminded me we haven't been making enough of our colleagues online. So does anyone online want to add anything, ask anything, suggest anything? Please do. Those of you who can turn on your cameras and speak, or those of you who want to write in the chat. Assuming people may write in the chat anyway, but please do join in if you would like to.
Yes.
Go for it. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, well, I appreciated a lot the discussion and the talks. There are 2 things I would like to add. The first one has to do with the students, the Tanzanian students. Indeed, it would be very important to see how many of those students who studied in the Soviet Union then moved to Great Britain. Many did so. So there is a lot of movement. At the same time, at the beginning, the first Tanzanian students who go to the Soviet Union, they come from Great Britain. So I think Hanga was among them. Zanzibari, right? You should, I don't remember exactly, but certainly they did not come directly from Zanzibar or Tanzania. They came from Great Britain. Anyway, it's a very, very big story, definitely. So in all, a comment I would like to make is that I agree with what Thoralf said about the contact zone, and of course it is a very important, way to approach the story as an entry point. However, what might be one difficulty in the project is to write full stories. Covering a longer period of history and telling the story from the beginning to the end, because and this is what the field suffers from in general. We have, a chapter from what was happening in the Soviet Union or the Soviet policies. Then we may have a chapter about China, fewer things about Tanzania and other countries of the global south. So this will be the challenge, and I think that this is something that the project has to think how to address. But it's very important that you can help one another and with collaborate and covering all these the countries and different actors from different perspectives. So it's a great strength of the project, and I really hope that you will take advantage of this, because it's very, very well organized at this stage. So I'm sure that at the end we will have food stories. I hope you see the point that I try to make.
Yeah, thank you so much. Christina, do you want to come in with something?
I'm not sure if I'm totally coming left center and derailing your complete discussion now. I hope I don't. When I'm looking at what today was called, it's asking for socialisms and drawing on your discussion of language and contact zones or zones of encounter. I'm wondering how it historically in the popular press, for example, and stuff like that, what does Tanzania make of socialism? So beyond our kind of brand ideological discussions, just to see what does Tanzania make of that? And one thing that struck me was in one of the presentations earlier about the film industry. So Tanzania happily gets money from Denmark for making films, but then goes to the USSR, to the film festival. And so, that it strikes me there's super interesting connections and relationships, and, where the money comes from is a historical question anywhere, a historical approach anyway. But in this case, it's probably quite an interesting one. So yeah, like I said, I don't want to derail your discussion, but I think that would actually be super interesting. It's like, what are these socialisms in Tanzania, and as Tanzanians make something of it, rather than looking at, what's the idea that China flies in or that the USSR flies in. Anyway, it was something that came to me when I was listening.
Yeah, great points, I think. Thank you so much, both of you. And I think it's a great point, Christina. It's not derailing at all. I would say it's great. Did you want to?
I have a question for the one who was maybe for Andrea, but considering that Tanzania has maybe one of the most important Asiatic community from Asia, living since long years. I mean, Indian, but also Chinese. I mean, we are speaking about the links between China and Tanzania during the socialist years. I mean, during the Cold War, but there is a long history of the community from Asia in Tanzania. So what is the place of this community in these relationships? Is there, I mean, did they play a role in these relationships? So is there, for example, I don't know, so some go-between, I mean, so some people will play the role of go-between between China and the Tanzanian government? First, it's my first question. And the second question is, where is India in this history? I mean, the Indian community is so important in Tanzania, and India was one of the major, and India, we could say also Indonesia, but India, the Indian community is so important in Tanzania. So where is India in this history? Sorry.
Thank you so much. And I think first I want to try to respond to the question raised by Christine about socialism. In my upcoming book, in my chapter 2, for instance, I discuss a little bit, and I start something like a question that Tanzanian socialism, but learning from China, I added a question mark. And this is because although the idea of implementing socialism in Tanzania begins since the early 1960s, its actual implementation was after the Arusha Declaration of 1967. But in 1965, when Nyerere went to China for the first time, he said to Chairman Mao that he went to China to learn. And so he was very much interested with the ways in which the Chinese people live, and the ways in which the government, the policies and everything. So I link Tanzanian socialism with Maoism. And because in some of Nyerere's speech, he said, it is not possible for the low-income countries to adopt socialist policies because there is no enough proletariats, there is no industries. But he said it is possible to adopt Mao's idea of peasants, because we had a number of peasants, and to him, I think he was buying an idea of Mao that peasants useful enough, can be useful enough to bring socialism, not only proletariats. So in my view, I think, although he adopted much of Maoism, he never say openly that we adapted from Maoism. And he was in one time asked by many people and about whether he borrowed from China or from Russia. And he said, no, I not borrow from anyone. And what he said is that, of course, he learned from China, from Russia, and from elsewhere. But he said he learned and implemented those ideas based on Tanzanian social, economic, and political context of that time. So he said that it's not a Maoism, no, that from the Soviet Union, but and he was trying to refer that from the pre-colonial Tanzania, that people lived happily, sharing each and everything. So he said we used to have this system, but it was only the same. Yeah. So he said it was not maybe taken from China or from Russia, but in fact, you will find that many of the ideas were coming from China. And then Gabriel asked about the presence of these Asian communities and with the link to the socialism. Yes, of course, I think if you take back the history, you find that these Asian communities in the country were treated as the second group in the hierarchy after the whites, then the Asians, then the Africans. So, of course, after independence, these were economically very strong compared to the blacks. So they had some industries, businessmen, many of them were doing business. But these guys suffered a lot after Tanzania had adopted socialist policies, because Nyerere nationalized many of those industries and calling them as, that they exploited us, so we're taking back. Yeah, so of course they suffered a lot, and many of them could not survive. I mean, went back, others to India, others to the UK, and such kind of thing. Yeah.
Brilliant. I'm conscious that we're over time, so it's been fascinating, but I feel that we should stop probably at this point. But it's been a really fascinating discussion. I've really enjoyed it and an excellent afternoon. So thank you for inviting me. It's been really enjoyable, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from the project.